As you look at the results in front of you, you start to wonder if you're going insane. Have you just made some silly mistake that's given you totally misleading test results? Because what you appear to have discovered makes no sense at all. A concentration of uranium this high? It can't be possible. You work at a uranium enrichment plant in France. You deal with uranium day in and day out, and you know just about everything there is to know. Yet you've never seen anything quite like this. Your task for the day had been to carry out a series of checks on a natural uranium sample. Nothing out of the ordinary for someone who works in a uranium plant. The only reason you were carrying out the checks was a slight isotopic anomaly in some samples from Gabon, and nobody suspected that there wouldn't be a simple explanation. But here you are, looking at a result that contradicts everything you thought you knew. These results suggest that the uranium was involved in a nuclear reaction. But how could a nuclear reaction have happened in a remote mine in Gabon? Maybe it was a contamination. But if not, it could mean a nuclear reaction had happened naturally. That would rewrite history and change everything you thought you knew. See, a nuclear reaction is no small matter. Once upon a time, scientists weren't even sure if such a thing was possible. You remember when the first nuclear reactor was created back in the 1940s? It was man-made, built by a physicist called Enrico Fermi. And you were just a child at the time, so you don't remember the events well, but the whole world was in awe at the groundbreaking discovery. Later, as you went on to study physics, you'd realize what a monumental achievement it was. You learned how Fermi had just been starting his career in physics when scientists discovered nuclear fission for the first time, and he'd begun to ponder the implications. Maybe this mysterious process could be used on purpose by humans to create energy. To investigate this theory, he carried out some experiments with uranium, an essential component of nuclear fission. All this would eventually lead to setting up the first nuclear chain reaction. At least, so he thought at the time. In 1942, Fermi and his team assembled a reactor built of 45,000 graphite blocks and wood, materials that acted as the reactor's neutron moderator. A powder made of uranium oxide was poured into the blocks to set the right conditions for a reaction. And finally, a control rod made of cadmium was used to control the reaction by absorbing neutrons and acting as a kind of brake. The reactor was named Chicago Pile 1. One day later that year, Fermi attempted the experiment. The trick was basically to get the level of criticality needed to guarantee self-sustaining nuclear fission. Nuclear fission happens when an atom splits in two parts and releases energy. Atoms contain protons and neutrons in their central nucleus. But when the nucleus splits during fission, its resulting pieces have less combined mass than the original nucleus. This means mass becomes nuclear energy, which has great potential as a power source. Once the reaction becomes self-sustaining, it can continue with no intervention because the neutrons created through fission give off enough energy to sustain another reaction. For this to be possible, the neutron multiplication factor has to be high enough. Basically, it was a highly complex experiment. Nobody had attempted it before, and nobody was sure it would work. So many precise factors had to line up perfectly. No wonder the idea of this happening in nature seemed impossible, but the experiment was successful. It was monumental within your discipline and for all of humankind. Fermi proved nuclear energy could generate power, and his model was used as a baseline for large-scale nuclear reactors built afterwards. Everyone thought it was the first nuclear reactor ever. But how could something that was discovered as recently as 1942 have happened without the intervention of man so long ago? Yet this is what the results are indicating. Your colleagues are incredulous when you tell them. But together you carefully check over the results and consider the possibilities. It was possible the data could be misleading due to contamination. But already your mind was swimming. What if this genuinely had happened naturally? How could it have taken place? How old would the reactor have to be? It was also crazy. You hadn't even been looking for a nuclear reactor in the first place. But you definitely got more than you'd bargained for. You realized that there was more of the isotope uranium-235 than there should be, more than there had been in any other uranium sample ever. Natural uranium, which is taken from the crust of the Earth or rocks from the Moon, is made up of only around 0.720% of uranium-235. But rock in Oklo only contained 0.717%. It might sound like a pretty minor difference, but it's actually incredibly significant. The concentration of uranium-235 was supposed to be so constant throughout all natural sources in the solar system that it's commonly used to calibrate devices. How come this piece of uranium was breaking an established natural law? And as well as contradicting science, the finding meant that this uranium was the high-grade fissile sort. And since you needed to be sure that none of the uranium handled is used for weapons purposes, you needed to carry out an investigation. It was definitely weird, but whatever. You assumed it had to be some kind of artificial contamination. Maybe this uranium had been contaminated with depleted uranium, which has less U-235 at some point during the production process. This was sounding slightly more likely. You decided to take a look. First, you traced the process of sourcing the uranium back in time. It had been through a long journey to get to where you are now. From the Loch mine in Gabon to a mill nearby to a processing plant in France, and now here, in this enrichment plant. Luckily, samples of the ore were kept along each stage for the very purpose of carrying out investigations like this one. It was easy to check the properties and figure out if there had been any contamination. One by one, you checked them over, but the results were strange. It turned out that the samples at every stage had a lower level of uranium-235 than they should. The ore you examined wasn't an anomaly. But why? You were really scratching your head now. Maybe other researchers had already split the isotopes during artificial fission, a nuclear chain reaction similar to the one Fermi carried out. Then again, that seemed unlikely considering the remoteness of the mine in Loch. After investigating further, it was clear that this wasn't the case. If so, there would be depleted uranium missing, but there wasn't. Another theory was that a bomb had exploded in Africa without anyone noticing. Since bombs cause nuclear reactions, this would have changed the ratio of U-235 and U-238, the other isotope present in uranium. Yet the readings were found to be localized to the ore in the mine, so you had to dismiss that idea too. The mystery grew unless a natural reaction really had happened, so you looked for fission products, the isotopes of elements created during nuclear fission. Sure enough, there they were. The uranium had somehow become a natural reactor that went critical, burned up a portion of its nuclear fuel, and then shut down. There was only one question left: how? You weren't just assuming that any nuclear reaction had to be man-made because you were a stubborn scientist or a fanboy of Fermi. There were good scientific principles to suggest why natural nuclear reactors should be impossible. So to answer the question of how, we need to take a deep dive into the science. There's been plenty of talk of uranium-235, but what even is it? Well, uranium has two principal isotopes, U-235 and U-238. The ratio of these two in uranium ore should be the same everywhere, but that's not to say the ratio has always been the same. Uranium decays over time, and both the isotopes decay differently. Now, U-235 has a shorter half-life, which means its concentration within uranium decreases with time. There was a higher concentration in the past than there is now. For U-238, the opposite is true. Its concentration increases over time. So what? Well, this alone doesn't prove that a natural nuclear reaction took place, but it does give a clue. The ratio of U-238 and U-235 that exists now doesn't make it possible for a nuclear reaction to take place. But if the ratio were different, it could be possible. And since the isotopes decay at different rates, once upon a time the ratio would have been different, and it could have been optimal. 2 billion years ago, the ratio of uranium-235 to U-238 was about 3%, which incidentally is perfect for a light water-moderated chain reaction. So the first hint was that the reaction happened a very, very long time ago. And this wasn't the only thing. Other conditions for a nuclear reaction were met in the Loch mine. First, there was a high concentration of uranium in the ore body, 10% or more, and the ore was concentrated in seams at least half a meter thick. During a sustained chain reaction, the fissioning of a uranium-235 nucleus emits 2.5 neutrons, one of which induces fission in another nucleus, whilst the others are absorbed. The ore seam, therefore, needs to be relatively thick to allow for this absorption. It sounds complicated, but trust me. Secondly, there was water in the mine. This was perhaps the most important part of all. For a nuclear chain reaction to happen and be self-sustaining, it needs a moderator, and water fits the role perfectly. Water slows down neutrons and makes controlled fission possible. Without this, the atoms wouldn't have split. But it can't just be any kind of water. There's both heavy water and so-called ordinary water in the world. Heavy water contains a type of hydrogen called deuterium, whereas ordinary water is made of protium, and it also contains unique properties that allow it to act as a moderator. Nowadays, heavy water is needed for a nuclear reaction to happen because the ratio of U-235 and U-238 found in uranium now. But remember how the ratio changes over time? Well, 2 billion years ago, there was more U-235, which means ordinary water could have moderated the reaction. Amazingly, every single condition for a nuclear reactor was met. Theoretically, a fission chain reaction could have been triggered in the uranium deposits all those years ago, but at the same time it seemed impossible to prove it. You just couldn't go to the mine and check the conditions for the reaction because there was no guarantee that the conditions were the same now as they had been all that time ago. Plus, given that the reaction happened billions of years ago, there would surely be no traces left. The Earth moves over that large a time span, especially uranium in the presence of circulating water like that found in the mine. The only way it could be proven would be through a fossilized nuclear reactor. It seemed like a long shot, but it was worth a go. After investigating the mine, this is exactly what you found. All the conditions had been met, they were still in place now, and there was a fossilized nuclear reactor. Incredible! Even better, you found a footprint of fission products in the ore that was there too. So what did all this mean? What had happened in the Oklo mine? Picking apart the evidence, you were able to paint a fuller picture. It seemed like the fission reaction had continued off and on for hundreds of thousands of years, sustaining itself fully throughout the time. Then eventually it stopped reacting and shut down. This probably happened around 1 billion years ago. To put that into context, humans have only been around for about 200,000 years. Jellyfish, one of the world's oldest species, have been around for maybe 500 million years. Even the Earth itself is only estimated to be 4 or 5 billion years old. Basically, this nuclear reactor is only half as old as the very planet we live on, and it's hard to wrap your head around. But why did this happen in Oklo, and has it ever happened anywhere else? Oklo may have had the right conditions, but it's hard to know why the uranium deposit went critical there. One reason could be the lack of elements in the mine that prevent a reaction taking place, like lead and cadmium. Another possible is its remoteness. While being remote doesn't make a nuclear reaction more likely, it does improve the likelihood of the byproducts being preserved. As for whether there have been other natural reactors, there's no way to be certain. 16 sites of nuclear fission reactions have been found in Oklo, but none elsewhere in the world. That's not enough to say that there aren't any more, but it's pretty unlikely that conditions would be remote enough to have preserved the evidence anywhere else. Experts suggest that there have been other natural reactors like this that were destroyed by geological processes or eroded away. And what does all this mean anyway? It might be kinda cool that such an ancient nuclear reactor has been found, but does it have any relevance to anything real? Well, it certainly provides some insights into waste management. While active, Oklo probably depleted around 10 tons of uranium ore. Yet the waste left was so insignificant that visiting researchers didn't even notice. Looking at what happened gives some clues about how to deal with the waste produced by nuclear power plants, which is essential if nuclear ever becomes a conventional source of energy. It was a perfect paradise, but because of the disobedience of man, humanity lost access to the Garden of Eden forever. But was it a real place, and if so, where is it today? Even those individuals who might not know anything about Christianity or the Bible are typically aware of the Garden of Eden, a perfect place without evil, death, or pain, whose vast gardens were full of rich, always ripe fruits and the most beautiful flowers on all of earth. In essence, the Garden of Eden is paradise, and often used symbolically to represent perfect bliss. But humanity messed things up by, well, being human. You're probably familiar with the story of the apple and how Eve, the first woman, was tempted to pluck the apple from the tree of knowledge at the heart of the Garden of Eden and thus disobeyed God. After pressuring Adam to also eat the apple, both Adam and Eve were cursed to leave the perfect Garden of Eden and wander the earth for the rest of their lives, where they would have to toil with blood, sweat, and tears to make a living for themselves out of the hard, unforgiving ground. And that's pretty much been humanity's state for thousands of years. But could there be more to the story than just myth? Interestingly, the Bible actually records the Garden of Eden not as a spiritual place, but a very real physical space that's definitely located somewhere on our planet. In Genesis 2:8-14, the Bible states the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden. Now a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it parted and became 4 riverheads. The name of the first is Pishon, the name of the second river is Gihon, the name of the third river is Hiddekel, Tigris, the fourth river is the Euphrates. The Genesis narrative clearly states that a single river went through the Holy Garden, and when it exited turned into 4 rivers. 2 of those rivers are Pishon and Gihon, rivers that we don't recognize today, but 2 of them are well known to us, Hiddekel, better known as Tigris, and the Euphrates. Both of these rivers run through ancient Mesopotamia and straight through the modern-day nation of Iraq. The 2 rivers even share the same headwaters in the area around Mount Ararat, which means that finding the Garden of Eden should be as simple as finding the other 2 rivers and seeing where they intersect the 2 known rivers. But there's a problem because the Pishon and Gihon rivers are unknown to us, and no other rivers flow out of the same headwaters as the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Famous French reformer John Calvin made note of the difficulties in using known geography to locate the Garden of Eden, writing the following: "Many think that the Pishon and Gihon are the Ganges and the Nile River. This error, however, of these men is abundantly refuted by the distance of the positions of these rivers. Persons are not wanting who fly across even to the Danube, as if indeed the habitation of one man stretched itself from the most remote part of Asia to the extremity of Europe. But since many other celebrated rivers flow by the region of which we are speaking, there is a greater probability in the opinion of those who believe that two of these rivers are pointed out, although their names are now obsolete. Be this as it may, the difficulty is not yet solved. For Moses divides the one river which flowed by the garden into 4 heads, yet it appears that the fountains of the Euphrates and the Tigris were far distant from each other. A popular belief at the time of John Calvin was that the 2 other rivers which poured out of the Garden of Eden were the mighty Ganges and Nile rivers, 2 of the largest and most important rivers in the world then and today. But Calvin notes the difficulty in this being true, as obviously the rivers are very far apart from each other, and he notes that one man in the ancient world surely couldn't have habituated on both the Nile and Ganges. The distance, again, is simply far too great. Calvin then supposes what others have, that the names of the rivers have been lost to us, and that the Pishon and Gihon are names for rivers that we know today by different names. This isn't entirely implausible, as the Fertile Crescent was known for being a location of much strife in ancient times. The names of even 2 important rivers being wiped out from the cultural record is not impossible, but Calvin makes a final observation that even if this were true, and though the Tigris and Euphrates share the same headwaters, they simply don't flow from the exact same source, a singular unified river which splits into 4. What we have now is 3 missing rivers, because don't forget the river that flowed through Eden is what split into 4 to create the other 4 rivers. And yet the author of Genesis is insistent that Eden was a real geographical place and not a symbol or mythological location. Creationists and biblical literalists have an answer for the missing rivers. They were destroyed by flooding, rather by one specific flood, Noah's flood. In the Bible, the world grows so wicked that God decides to wipe the slate clean. He finds Noah and his family to be the only faithful people left on the face of the earth, which, to be fair, at the time would have only been a few tens of thousands of people. Thus, to ensure humanity survives, he orders Noah to build a massive ark that can hold him and his family, along with 2 of every land species, male and female, of course. The rain starts to pour, which confuses people because until that point there had been no rain, and eventually everything floods, leaving only Noah and his boat full of animals to survive and repopulate the earth. The Bible is clear that the flood was so bad that it covered even the tops of the mountains up. There are obviously a whole host of problems with this account, namely that it would be impossible to house and feed 2 of every land species for over a year on one boat. Also, it would be impossible to even build that boat without the assistance of modern technology, though Noah did build for years. The material cost alone would have made it necessary for Noah to be the Jeff Bezos of his day. Though to be fair, the flood account doesn't mention if Noah was rich or not. Then there's the more scientific problems. Flooding the entire Earth so that even the tops of the mountains would be below sea level is simply impossible. All that water would have to go somewhere after the flood, and we're talking about incredible, mind-boggling amounts of water. At the very least, we should see that water locked up in massive glaciers dozens of miles tall at the poles, but we don't. If Noah's Ark had also been coasting on water above mountaintops so high, he would have had to deal with a thinner atmosphere, though we suppose it's possible the atmosphere would have been compressed by rising floodwaters, so perhaps that mitigates some of the altitude sickness which would be plaguing Noah and his animals. Perhaps most importantly of all, though, is the fact that there is simply zero evidence for a global flood, no matter what Ken Ham and his cherry-picked science like to say. But it might surprise you to learn that evidence for a regional flood is very much present, and one of staggering scale. The flood of Genesis is repeated across other ancient literature, including famously in the Epic of Gilgamesh, leading to cries of plagiarism from critics. This would be a stretch, for sure, as the 2 works bear nothing more than superficial similarities, but both could very well be reporting on a very real event, just not in quite the scale described in either work. Sediment deposits found across Iraq indicate that the region was prone to some massive flooding in the past. One sediment deposit in southeastern Iraq is a whopping 3 meters thick, with 2.4-meter deposits at the southeast of Baghdad. Those deposits were dated to about 2900 BC, nearly 1500 years before Genesis was officially put down on paper. The area, however, was already home to the descendants of those early scribes, and they would definitely have witnessed floods devastating enough to wash away entire villages, and wide enough to cover hundreds of square miles. Massive floods can indeed rewrite the geography of the Earth. We have ample evidence of large-scale catastrophic flooding erasing river systems from existing or diverting the flow of ancient rivers. But the problem once more becomes with where the floods took place. Massive regional flooding in the Mesopotamian Valley wouldn't have been able to reach the mountains where the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates lay. That would have required truly mythical levels of flooding. Without being able to extend that far, no amount of flooding could have erased our two missing rivers from existence. Climate change could have possibly dried up those two ancient rivers, but again, modern geography doesn't show any evidence of major rivers linking up with a shared source in the area. The Tigris and Euphrates could possibly have shared a source in the past, but even this is highly unlikely given the terrain and course of the two rivers today. Even then, the original river, which fed the four rivers who broke off like the spokes of a wheel, is also missing from both geology and history. No people from the area have ever reported any such river in the terrain. It could be argued then that the Garden of Eden exists spiritually, perhaps just out of phase with the real world. That's why no physical evidence of its location can actually be found. However, the ancient writers were adamant that this was a real location, though it might be best not to find it today even if we could, given that God very famously set a flaming sword and a troop of angels to guard its entrance. The most likely answer, though, is the simplest. It was a myth. The Genesis account is not meant to be taken literally and was simply a mythologized account of the creation of man. Not just an origin story, but a way for early man to explore some truths about God himself and his relationship with us. We see the same in the poetic work of the Book of Job. Itself not a historical account, but rather a poetic exploration into some of the most difficult aspects of life, spirituality, and the nature of good and evil. What might surprise you is that this was not a new revelation. Christians throughout history have always believed that Genesis was not history, but enlightened mythology that was supposed to be studied for its spiritual truths, not its historical accuracy. Famed Christian philosopher William Lane Craig argues that Genesis should be considered mytho-history, as it contains accurate historical details alongside what are obvious mythological passages. This view fits perfectly into the way that ancient man understood and spoke about his world, combining real history with mythological flourishes woven together into a single narrative. What's curious or sad about Genesis is that its ancient audience understood better what parts were myth and what parts weren't compared to a modern audience. As Dr. Craig points out, the ancient Jews lived and died by agriculture, which meant they understood things like the water cycle extremely well, as their lives literally depended on it. Genesis claims that before the flood, Earth was watered by springs from beneath it, as no rain had ever fallen until that fateful day that God flooded the earth. But an ancient farming audience would have understood this to be pure myth, due to their knowledge of the water cycle. Meanwhile, modern creationists like Ken Ham try to twist science into making something work that even the ancients knew was never meant to be taken as physical fact. This likely is also true about the Garden of Eden, as man did not descend from two single individuals, but rather evolved from the great apes. So if you're looking for the Garden of Eden today, it exists only as a symbol of what man loses every time he disobeys God's commands. Your Garden of Eden is the peace you could enjoy if you followed God's will, such as being kind to those who hate you or practicing restraint against your passionate impulses. You're probably like billions of other people on planet Earth, happily going about your daily life without a care in the world for any of the fundamental forces that make life on Earth possible. Yet, even as you watch this video, one of those forces is experiencing an unexplained anomaly and unexpectedly weakening, potentially leaving the Earth vulnerable to the almost complete extinction of life. If what scientists are watching develop in real time persists, humanity has at best years left to live, and the only thing to survive us will be microbial life in the deepest caves or darkest depths. In 1958, it was well understood that the sun sent a steady stream of very dangerous high-energy particles and radiation crashing toward Earth. What kept life safe from this peril was the Earth's powerful magnetic field, stretching out thousands of miles into space and shielding us from the worst of the solar wind. So try to imagine their horror when scientists in 1958 discovered that this invisible shield we rely on for life to continue on Earth was actually weakening. Known as the South Atlantic Anomaly, it's an area of weakening magnetic field that grows on average by 12.4 miles per year. The area has been closely monitored since its discovery, and today, this chink in the Earth's protective armor comes down to just over 100 miles over the surface of our planet. The anomaly has already taken a devastating toll on manned and unmanned spacecraft, and modern satellites can't operate in the area without special precautions or risk destruction. But what is this anomaly exactly, and why is it so dangerous? Well, Texans might not like it, but the truth is all life on Earth is solar-powered. Yes, even you. The food you eat either ate food that got its energy from the sun or was food that got its energy from the sun. For the kids in the cheap seats, we're talking about plants here. The sun is basically the giver of all life, but it can also be the taker of that same life. That's because all that nice warm sunshine you enjoy on a sunny summer day is only a tiny percentage of the energy the sun is blasting out into space in your direction. Basically, the sun is blasting a pure murder hate beam of radiation straight at your dumb face. But good guy Earth is there to shield you from the worst of it all, so all you feel is a nice warm ray of light and maybe some slight sunburn. And that's thanks to the Earth's magnetic field, which is generated by the movement of molten iron and nickel in the Earth's core. All that moving and shaking of those metals in our molten core generates a massive electrical current, which in turn creates a magnetic field which stretches out deep into space. That magnetic field is in effect a shield, which deflects or traps harmful solar wind and ensures that instead of your DNA being blasted apart, you'll at worst suffer a sunburn from staying outside too long. But just how bad could it really be if the magnetic field were to collapse suddenly? That's a great question, and we're glad you asked. 4.5 billion years ago, Mars had a thick, luscious atmosphere and plenty of liquid water to go around. We can see evidence of huge lakes and rivers all over the surface of the planet, and we know from studying the chemistry of the planet that it once was wrapped up in a thick atmosphere. Then, everything changed. In geological timescales, practically overnight. The world that might have once held an advanced dolphin species capable of spaceflight, you can't prove that it didn't exist, is today only a dusty rock. The killer? Its magnetic field. Scientists still don't understand why Mars's magnetic field shut down, but they believe it was due to its smaller size compared to Earth, as well as the composition of its core. The Earth is bigger than Mars, almost twice as big, which means that we have a large molten core that would take longer to cool than Mars's own core. But that might only be part of the picture. Rock is a great insulator. That's why our core has remained molten so long. But it's not just heat from its original formation that's still keeping the core hot, but also the decay of radioactive elements inside our core that's helping to keep things nice and warm. Some scientists suspect that Mars lacked such heavy radioactive elements in its own core, which would have led to a much faster cooling core than the Earth's own. With a weakening magnetic field, the solar wind sandblasted Mars's atmosphere away, and eventually its water. Any life, such as spacefaring dolphins, would have been bombarded by cosmic and solar radiation, their DNA destroyed by the high-energy particles ripping it to pieces. Unless that life moved deep underground, extinction was quick to follow. And now it may happen here on Earth. The South Atlantic Anomaly has been closely monitored for decades and is now split into two valleys that continue to move across the ocean and grow in size. However, it's not quite all doom and gloom just yet, as new data shows that the anomaly may perhaps be part of a natural cycle that's going on for millions of years. We already know to expect anomalies in the Earth's magnetic field, and that's because the molten core is not uniform in its iron and nickel content, whose motion generates the magnetic field. These irregularities in the content will inevitably lead to irregularities in the strength of the magnetic field around the Earth, and thus the Southern Atlantic Anomaly is born. There's no evidence that the Earth's magnetic field ever weakened to the point of causing a mass extinction event, so scientists are hopeful that the SAA will continue to evolve over time before eventually correcting itself. For now, the greatest danger that the SAA possesses is to low Earth satellites, which frequently pass through the anomaly. They must be careful to shut down sensitive electronics or suffer serious consequences, such as the Japanese satellite that destroyed itself when charged particles slipping through the weakened magnetic field damaged some of its electronics. Even the space shuttle experienced the shutting down of laptops as it flew through the anomaly, and the ISS regularly passes through it, but thanks to its thick shielding, suffers few if any ill effects. While scientists don't suspect the SAA to lead to a magnetic field collapse, there may be no telling how the Southern Atlantic Anomaly evolves in the future. If things take a turn for the worse and the anomaly dips below the atmosphere, something it's already dangerously close to doing, it could spell disaster for any living beings in the geographic vicinity of the anomaly. Thankfully for now, the anomaly is over the Southern Atlantic, but as it moves and grows, it could eventually pass over heavy population centers. What the Southern Atlantic Anomaly means for life on Earth is still largely unknown. It's a bird, it's a plane, it's a super Earth? Perhaps one of the most revolutionary discoveries in modern astronomy is the discovery of an entirely unpredicted class of planets known as super-Earths. These rocky planets mass from anywhere between 2 to 10 times Earth's own mass and are believed to have a rocky core, and some might even be better suited for life than our own planet. It was initially believed that the most common type of planet in the solar system were gas giants. It was a gas giant, after all, that was the first exoplanet ever discovered by mankind. However, as our ability to spot planets in other solar systems has increased, scientists made a shocking discovery. It wasn't gas giants or even small rocky planets like Mercury that were most common, but rather large rocky planets. Though as smaller planets are more difficult to discover, our findings may still be accidentally biased. So why did scientists go with the term super Earth? The name comes from the fact that along with the rocky core, these planets are able to retain a significant atmosphere, features only found in 2 planets in our own solar system, Earth and Venus. However, the name can be misleading, and many have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of a super Earth. When you think of a super Earth, after all, you're probably thinking of a planet that's largely like our own Earth, rocky with oceans and a welcoming atmosphere. But that's not what super Earths are at all. Or at least that's not what most super Earths are like. 55 Cancri E, for example, is a super Earth completely covered by an ocean of lava hot enough to melt iron, basically making it the Mount Doom of planets. Meanwhile, Gliese 1214b is believed to be the polar opposite, a water world completely covered by an ocean. Within these 2 extremes, scientists have found a plethora of worlds. Initially, scientists believed that super Earths could be super habitable and even have better conditions for life than our own planet. Their increased size would offer more surface area for life and be less perturbed by the gravity of nearby objects, and thus offer more climate stability to its inhabitants. On our own planet, the leading cause of extinction is climate change, with periodic ice ages wiping out vast numbers of species. At the time, it seemed like the name Super Earth was quite apt, as these worlds would be far more habitable than Earth. However, as scientists refined their knowledge of the physics and geological processes on these super Earths through experimentation, a different story began to emerge. Firstly, the sheer mass of these planets means that many of them are bound to be water worlds. The increased gravity would attract greater amounts of icy comets than our own smaller Earth did, leading to planet-spawning oceans that could be miles deep. And what's wrong with that, you might ask? After all, life almost certainly began in the ocean on our own planet, and the ocean remains far more biodiverse than land does. More water should mean more life, right? Well, the biggest problem with a large water world is that the increased gravity and great depth of its oceans would smash water molecules together into ice formed not by low temperatures but by incredible pressure. This extremely dense layer of ice would act as a form of sealant around the rocky core of the planet, blocking off the core from the surface and shutting off the carbon cycle for the world. This may be biased toward carbon-based life forms, but even if non-carbon-based life forms are possible, this thick layer of ice would shut off vital minerals regularly exposed by geological processes on smaller worlds and prevent them from entering the biological life cycle. Even if you aren't covered in water, that big gravity field is gonna be a problem for the exact same reason. A super-Earth is going to attract a lot more celestial objects and thus be prone to much more extinction-level events from asteroid impacts. While that wouldn't preclude life entirely, cyclical extinction-level impacts certainly would make the evolution of intelligent life extremely difficult, if not impossible. Super-Earths could also be prone to attracting more gas, and thus have much thicker atmospheres than here on our regular old dumb Earth. A much more dense atmosphere comes with a whole host of problems, and we need to only look at Venus for one very good reason why a super-Earth with a thick atmosphere would be uninhabitable. Temperatures on the surface there are hot enough to melt lead, and while the planet is closer to the Sun than we are, it is still well within the habitable range of our Sun. Venus's thick, oppressive atmosphere is the real reason for its uninhabitable surface temperatures, and a super-Earth with a similarly thick atmosphere would likely suffer from the same life-killing global warming effect. Another nail in the coffin for super-Earth habitability is the effect of the planet's mass on its core. Our own core is only partially molten, and its rotation maintains a powerful electromagnetic field which protects life on Earth from cosmic radiation. On a super-Earth, though, the massive pressures at the core from the increased mass of the planet makes it extremely unlikely that its core would remain liquid for very long, perhaps only a couple of billion years, before it inevitably solidifies into a solid core. While life certainly could evolve during the time the core was liquid, it would find it very difficult to survive as the planet's magnetic field weakened and eventually collapsed entirely. DNA is very delicate, and while some radiation is good to promote mutations that can spur on evolution, too much radiation leads to the breakdown of DNA. Life on a super-Earth with a solid core would likely only be very simple and only exist in places shielded by cosmic radiation. However, it's not all doom and gloom, and super-Earths could possibly give rise to a void ecology, or life that exists in outer space. So we know there are organisms from our own planet that can exist for a short time in space, so the idea of a void ecology is not completely out of the question. However, the problem with looking for spacefaring life forms is that, as far as we know it, life cannot get started in the extremely harsh environment of space. It must start somewhere more hospitable, and then make the move to space. Super-Earths with solidifying cores could be the perfect nursery for a void ecology, with organisms becoming increasingly resistant to cosmic radiation via the slow, multi-million-year process of its planet losing its magnetic field. All it would take then is a lucky asteroid impact to knock debris infected with these life forms into outer space, an improbable but not impossible proposition. However, for life as we know it, super-Earths are looking increasingly unlikely to be hospitable. But scientists have high hopes for a class of super-Earths that range in the low end of the scale, with a mass only twice as big as our own Earth. These smaller super-Earths have many of the advantages of larger super-Earths: climate stability, longer molten core lifespan, larger surface areas, without the disadvantages of being as big as their larger cousins. These super-habitable worlds may end up being havens for life, even intelligent life, though the increased gravity would make rocketry more difficult and expensive, perhaps greatly delaying or even preventing a species from ever making it to space. Earth may turn out to be a backwater planet that's barely habitable by alien standards, but seeing as it's the best we got in our galactic neighborhood, we'd better start taking problems like global warming and pollution seriously, because there's nowhere to run to. Near the beginning of 2020, scientists with the Canadian Hydrogen Intensity Mapping Experiment, or CHIME, released a paper which announced an interesting discovery. Not only was the Earth receiving far more FRBs than previously thought, they had observed that FRB 180916J0158 plus 65 was repeating every 16.35 days. FRBs, or fast radio bursts, are sudden large pulses of radiation that erupt from somewhere outside of our galaxy. Though they last for fractions of a second, they expend an immense amount of energy, maybe as much as hundreds of millions of suns. Imagine that you're standing on your roof, and in a city 1,000 miles away from you, your friend is also standing on their roof. Your friend quickly shouts "Hi" to signal you. Think about how loud they'd have to shout for you to hear. Not only are you far away, but there's obstacles, buildings that may block or bounce sound. Also, there's traffic and a lot of other noise pollution between you two. Now, scale that communication scenario up a bazillion times and you have a sense of just how much radiation an FRB has to emit for our radio telescopes on Earth to detect it. Space is surprisingly a noisy place, not sound-wise, but in terms of celestial bodies giving off energy. NASA has actually recorded a number of emissions, such as radio waves from the Sun's corona or Jupiter's magnetic fields. Since we first discovered FRBs in 2007, we've made it a point to specifically listen for them. So far, we've detected 150 emissions. Out of those, only 11 have repeated. The rest have been one-offs that have come from different directions and from various galaxies. Research shows that for some of the repeating FRBs, with each cluster of repetition, the signal experiences frequency drift and gets weaker. After a few repeats, the signal seems to vanish. Actually, that doesn't necessarily mean the signal stopped, it's just that it may have become faint or lost among all the other noise that the telescope has picked up. This suggests that some of what we consider to be one-off FRBs probably repeat too, we just don't detect the repetition. One researcher has described FRBs as massive at their source, but the strength of the signal reaching the Earth is 1,000 times weaker than a signal from a mobile phone broadcasting from the Moon. In fact, some research suggests that the Earth is receiving thousands of FRBs a day, and we simply don't notice because we're only looking at small regions of the sky for short periods of time, and our telescopes aren't yet sensitive enough to detect everything. Excitingly, the signals for FRB 180916.J0158 plus 65 have remained fairly consistent. After a year of observation, researchers were able to confirm that the FRB has a distinct pattern, where over the course of 4 days, the signal would release a burst or two each hour, then it would go silent for another 12 days and repeat. 28 separate clusters of signal bursts were recorded from September 16, 2018 through October 30, 2019 for a total of 409 days. Interestingly, each burst of signals have been different. As of yet, there's been no discernible repeating or overlap of the signal. However, there are enough similarities between the flares to suggest that they're part of a single repeating pattern. Currently, researchers have only been able to pinpoint the location of where 8 FRBs originated from, including 180916.J0158 plus 65. This FRB is coming from the edges of a nearby spiral galaxy, SDSS J015800.28 plus 654253.0. Yeah, another catchy name, which according to scientists is similar to our Milky Way. Unfortunately, by the term nearby we meant 457 million light-years away from our solar system. However, by far, it's the closest FRB we've discovered. The first repeating FRB traced, FRB 121102, originates in a small dwarf galaxy with a high rate of star formation some 3 billion light-years from Earth. To answer the question probably buzzing through your brain right now, are FRBs, and this FRB in particular, aliens attempting to contact us? The simple answer is possibly. FRBs are quite mysterious. Currently, scientists can only speculate about what causes them, so we can't entirely discount the fact that aliens are signaling to us directly or pinging our universe, possibly hoping to find signs of intelligent life. However, it's kind of unlikely that the radiation emissions would be produced by aliens. If you're a highly intelligent life form who eons ago remember the energy from FRB 180916.J0158 plus 65 is taking some 457 million years to reach us and had the capacity to build one or more huge, probably solar-powered transmitting devices that can hurtle immense amounts of radio waves into space to hopefully signal your neighbors and then alert them to the fact that you exist, wouldn't you send the same message several times so that you can make contact and be clearly understood? Sending different signal bursts or messages each time would be kinda like at the same time each day dialing a random phone number for another country out of a directory and then letting it ring once before hanging up, and doing that over and over and over again to try to communicate with other people. Of course, on the other hand, there is a chance that the aliens are intellectually superior to us, and they are sending a distinct message with FRB 10091765, but we humans are too dumb to figure it out. Even if the FRB was sent by aliens, unfortunately their civilization is already lost to time since the bursts have taken close to 500 million light-years to reach Earth. More likely than aliens, FRBs are caused by a particular celestial event. Since FRBs last only milliseconds, researchers think their sources might be small celestial objects only a few hundred kilometers across. Currently, one theory about the creation of FRBs that researchers are exploring is that the FRBs are flares from dying stars known as blitzars. A blitzar exhausts its nuclear fuel and collapses when it can no longer support its weight, and it spews radiation. Another theory is that FRBs are caused by the interaction between neutron stars and early OB-type star binary systems. Neutron stars are the remnants of supernovae. Diameter-wise, they aren't particularly large, maybe the size of a large city such as Chicago, but they are extremely dense, with masses much heavier than our sun. OB-type stars are short-lived, hot, massive, bright burning stars. The interaction between the two heavenly bodies and the wind coming off the OB-type star could create radiation spikes. Yet another theory is that the FRBs are created by magnetars, rare neutron stars with incredibly powerful magnetic fields. Astronomers have observed magnetars suddenly flaring in an immense burst. Possibly these bursts are caused by starquakes, a sudden disturbance of the magnetar structures that release built-up stresses from their swirling magnetic fields. Some of the energy is most likely expressed as radio waves. While a sudden random cataclysmic event such as a star collapse or a starquake makes sense in terms of causing a non-repeating FRB, it doesn't quite make sense for repeating FRBs such as 180916.J0158 plus 65. The implication being that if this FRB repeats on a regular basis, something has to be controlling the cycle. One of the theories postulated by the scientists who authored the paper is that the FRB is being modulated by an orbital motion. The area the FRB originated from is a star-forming region just outside the main galaxy. Perhaps the FRB is caused by interactions between a star and a stellar mass black hole. Or the waves could be giant radio pulses from a very active neutron star that's being eclipsed by a companion object. When the celestial object isn't being obscured, it transmits toward Earth. It's far less likely but possible that the source for this repeating FRB is a single celestial object such as a magnetar or an X-ray pulsar. Researchers find the data they've parsed doesn't really support that theory. Both magnetars and pulsars have a wobbling rotation that produces periodicity, however, none are known to wobble that slowly. Also, yes, there is a slight chance that aliens could be using their device to transmit at the same time in some sort of cycle only known to them. For FRB 180916.J0158 plus 65, scientists have a long-term chance to study the signal clusters to figure out exactly what causes the energy bursts. This may provide insight for figuring out patterns, behaviors, and root causes of other FRBs, and ultimately help researchers gain a clearer understanding of our universe. There exists on our planet an entire hidden world that has laid dormant for eons. But this world full of strange organisms from prehistoric times is slumbering no more. As global warming threatens the world's ice masses, some scientists have warned that sleeping in that same ice, completely isolated from the rest of the world for tens of thousands of years, could lurk deadly killers just waiting to be unleashed. In a quest to understand the potential threat, science has now discovered some of these ancient threats, and some were completely unknown to science until now. High up in the Tibetan mountains, scientists have labored to drill into some of the oldest and most pristine ice on Earth for years, and in doing so, brought back ice core samples that date back thousands and thousands of years. Two of these samples predate the earliest known human civilization by a whopping 11,000 years. Trapped within the ice lurks a sampling of the microscopic world present at the time the ice was formed. While the total biomass of trapped microbial life is vanishingly small, far less than seawater, scientists have refined techniques to identify what life exists within that ancient ice. What they've discovered has been nothing short of revolutionary for science. The two samples were collected in 1992 and 2015, and while the ice was untouched for thousands of years, upon being removed, the exterior was immediately contaminated with modern microbial life. For years, these icy cores were kept in frozen storage, the contents within kept pristine thanks to their icy prison. Recently, scientists discovered a way to at last melt the cores while eliminating any chance of modern contamination, allowing researchers to peer into the microbial world of prehistory. Keeping the samples in a cold room, the scientists used a sterilized bandsaw to saw away 0.2 inches of the entire outer layer of the ice core. Then they bathed the freshly sawed cores in ethanol to melt away a further 0.2 inches of ice. Finally, they used sterile water to melt away 0.2 more inches of ice. After losing over half an inch of ice, the cores were finally free of modern contaminants. And when scientists peered into their microscopes, they found a veritable Ice Age microbial Jurassic Park waiting for them. Investigating the two ice cores, scientists found 33 different groups of viruses, with hundreds of individual members of each. Of these groups of viruses, though, the greatest discovery was the fact that a whopping 28 of them were completely unknown to scientists until now. Forebodingly, in a follow-up interview, one researcher stated that humanity is far from having sampled even the majority of estimated virus groups still alive in frozen ice around the world today, meaning there are more viruses lurking, waiting for their chance to be free of their icy prison than we ever dreamt of. Tibet is far from the only place on Earth that researchers are digging up ancient microbial life, though, and in 2017, scientists made a profound discovery when they brought up ice samples from the depths of a frozen Antarctic lake. This lake had laid frozen for many thousands of years, effectively cocooning its underwater environment from the outside world. There, scientists discovered a microbe that they hope may answer the ultimate question about viruses. Did viruses evolve as a unique form of life, or did they arise as a parasitic life form that could exist only by infecting healthy cells? The question is a tricky one to answer, and scientists aren't even sure that viruses are truly alive anyway. That's because every living thing on Earth is made up of cells except for viruses. Viruses are in essence nothing more than a piece of genetic material encased in a hard shell that has only a single function: infect healthy cells and use the cell's energy resources to replicate. While at first glance that seems like the definition of a living organism, uses energy and is able to replicate, the pure simplicity of the virus leaves scientists split on the question of them being alive or not. It has even been theorized that viruses are nothing more than the descendants of malfunctioning nanomachines made by aliens and dispersed into the universe billions of years ago. The theory makes some sense, as a specific type of nanomachine known as a von Neumann probe would be able to visit every star system in the galaxy in just a few tens of thousands of years, compared to the millions or more it would take using traditional ships full of aliens. That's because the von Neumann probe has a unique ability that is eerily similar to that of a virus. It's able to use matter it encounters to create a copy of itself, and it does so exponentially. One makes a perfect copy, then those two make 2 copies, then the 4 make now another 4 copies, and so on and so on. And in a very short amount of time, you could have millions of these probes being sent to every corner of the galaxy. Perhaps then viruses are a form of an alien von Neumann probe, but not one designed to explore the galaxy but rather to create life. Again, the theory does make some sort of sense, as scientists are still unable to explain how the basic building blocks of life came together to actually start life here on Earth. And yet it's known that at the very first moment life was possible on Earth, it sprung into existence. That is a rather astonishing coincidence. It could be that ancient alien viruses were programmed to put those basic building blocks together, If you think this is an outlandish supposition, then you should know that modern gene editing techniques use hijacked viruses to modify DNA directly. Perhaps it's possible a sufficiently advanced civilization could have created artificial viruses to build DNA in the first place, and then simply seeded the galaxy with it, letting the machines go to work and life spring into existence where it was able to survive its environment. If these original alien viruses were also made of small bits of genetic material and weren't completely artificial, then perhaps evolution affected those viruses in unexpected ways, leading to the evolution of all modern viruses in our world today. This is just a theory, of course, and there's no proof that aliens really did seed the galaxy with viruses to help grow life. What isn't theory, though, is the plausibility of these ancient viruses being a deadly threat to life today, because viruses aren't truly alive in the sense that we understand it. They're able to survive their icy imprisonment, and scientists were shocked when a 30,000-year-old virus discovered in Siberia not only awoke, but began infecting healthy modern cells. This megavirus, so named because it's many times the size of what scientists thought was the biggest virus, infects amoebas. Once a victim has been found, the virus does much as any other virus, uses the amoeba to create more of its own kind, eventually destroying the amoeba. While this particular virus is incapable of infecting humans, the realization that a 30,000-year-old virus could be woken up and infect modern life was a sobering one for scientists. Before you fly into a full-blown panic and start building your doomsday bunker, it's important to know that viruses are highly specialized things, which means it can be difficult to impossible for a virus to infect a host it hasn't evolved to attack. The one benefit we have against these prehistoric viruses is that many of these viruses weren't around when there was a large population of humans, meaning the odds that they evolved to attack human cells are not that great. So you're likely safe from the effects of these ancient viruses. Except you also might not be, and the entire world could be wiped out by an ancient superbug literally any day now. Listen, we hate to throw an Uno reverse card at you, but viruses also happen to be one of the fastest evolving life forms, if they are in fact even alive, in existence today. The HIV virus, for instance, is the fastest evolving entity known, and while it reproduces very sloppily and accumulates a great deal of genetic mutations as it does so, it also reproduces at a rate of billions of copies of itself every day. You really only need one good copy that randomly mutates to affect humans for a virus to become a global pandemic. Then, of course, there's also the fact that scientists fear as the world melts, ancient strands of current diseases could go on a global comeback tour. Since we haven't been exposed to these diseases for thousands of years, modern humans would have virtually no defense against these microbial invaders. Even if a vaccine were to be developed, well, the Karens of the world would likely claim it causes autism and humans would die anyways. Of course, since global warming is just a giant hoax perpetrated by big science to sell more umbrellas, we really don't have to worry about any ancient viruses coming back to life. We all need a bit of privacy now and again. It's your human right, after all, to go about your day and not be watched over all the time by some kind of Big Brother surveillance technology. As that technology improves, though, and since you willingly feed huge chunks of personal data in a connected device, to some extent Big Brother already knows a lot about you. But imagine a bigger brother is watching over us. Surveillance that tracks humankind. That's not part of the world we know. Imagine the Earth is a kind of zoo and we're specimens to be studied. That might sound far-fetched, but there are some serious people who believe it to be true. Let us explain. There's this thing called zoo theory, which is sometimes called the zoo hypothesis. This theory tells us that there's a chance that we're being watched over by extraterrestrial life, but those guys are just not in the mood to tell us about it. We are animals living in their zoo. According to this theory, one of the reasons they don't come down here is that they want us to evolve naturally. Their superior intelligence would blow our minds. They might be looking down right now thinking, it's about time those guys stopped having wars and started sharing things, but they want us to evolve by ourselves. Then there's the Fermi paradox, which basically states that there are billions of stars in the Milky Way, and so the chance that humans are alone is pretty much nil. There just has to be intelligent life out there, and it must have technology that allows interstellar travel. Then you have to consider the universe outside of the Milky Way, and the number of stars is mind-blowing. Surely it's arrogant to believe that we're all alone, as if us little humans rule the universe. There's an organization called Messaging Extraterrestrial Intelligence, or METI for short. This group comprises of many space scientists and they get together to discuss the possibility of contacting aliens or us being watched over by aliens. On their website, the first thing you see is a statement that says METI doesn't rule out the possibility of life outside of Earth. If you scroll down, you'll see their list of objectives, and the first one goes like this: to conduct scientific research and educational programs in messaging extraterrestrial intelligence and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Scientists from all walks of life that are in METI are doing things right now, such as working on interstellar transmission technology. If ET could phone home, maybe humans could develop such long-distance communication tech. They also discuss the Fermi paradox and something called the Drake equation, which takes into account the size and age of the universe and what might be in it. Again, these people are not conspiracy theorists getting high in parents' basements. They are scientists. The president of METI is one Douglas Vakoch, and he's a renowned astrobiologist. This science is concerned with the evolution of the universe. For a long time, he's been working on interstellar messaging, but he's also well aware that human senses might not exactly work with alien senses. Even if we could send messages to other galaxies, if we said, "Hey guys, how's it going?" it might not work out. In fact, one of the latest blogs on the METI website asks if human language is any way to try and connect with aliens. The writer asks, is it a good way to send information to beings who are likely to be very different from us, whose bodies, sensory capabilities, cognition, environment, and experiences may be very different from our own? Then if we send out a message in human language form, which language? She states that while the Voyager disk, which is aboard NASA's famous Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 spacecraft, might have lots of information on it in 55 languages, we might better try and communicate in signs, shapes, and symbols and numbers. What's on the disk, you might ask? Well, if aliens pick it up, they'll find images of nature here on Earth, as well as many sounds of nature. They'll hear a message from former US President Jimmy Carter and be able to get down with a bit of Morse code. They'll see images of humans doing things and listen to the likes of Mozart and Beethoven. Chuck Berry is also on there, but unfortunately, no Led Zeppelin. They actually wanted to put the Beatles on the disc, but the record company EMI wouldn't allow that. Yeah, it's true. So back to the zoo. Those guys at METI often discuss something called the Great Silence, which relates to the question of why do these galactic zookeepers keep out of our face? Well, it's like we said, if aliens are that superior in intelligence, if they came into contact with us, they'd mess with our heads. We'd have to reevaluate life itself, and this would cause chaos. Just imagine if one day your dog got up and said in perfect English, "Hey buddy, can we skip the walk today? I'm thinking about going to Rover's house to discuss Wittgenstein's theory of the talking lion." If that happened, we'd have to start rewriting a few books, so the aliens stay away. In 2018, at a METI meeting, they talked about the idea of us being quarantined by aliens. This is how one researcher at METI explained that. It seems likely that extraterrestrials are imposing a galactic quarantine because they realize it would be culturally disruptive for us to learn about them. It's kind of the same thing as talking dogs. If they got into contact, our culture and society would be so disrupted, we would just collapse for a while. Just imagine if right now, as you're watching this, an alien spacecraft pops up outside your window. You're then informed that the world is an illusion and your consciousness is eternal and infinite. We bet you wouldn't clock in at work or go to school tomorrow. Some folks at METI also say that we haven't developed full cognitive abilities yet, that there might be another level of consciousness in our evolution. The famous, now deceased, Terence McKenna believed that certain psychedelics could provide a glimpse of what was possible in terms of developing a higher consciousness. He once said the idea of aliens coming down in a metal ship is totally preposterous. He believed alien life could be already here, and they might actually be in psilocybin mushrooms hidden in the very atoms of the things. He said those mushrooms are disguised as a drug, but might really be aliens. They are here, according to him, but we just don't get it yet. This might sound crazy to you, but serious scientists are now talking about the mind-blowing substance dimethyltryptamine, DMT, which takes people to places that are out of this world. Yes, lots of people visit aliens on their colorful trips. Research has shown that some people are absolutely convinced they saw aliens. This is why scientists at Johns Hopkins have been studying those breakthrough trips. We found more scientific research in the US that is taking seriously the possibility of DMT shooting people to another universe. In the mind, anyway. We're not saying this is proof that aliens are among us and we're being watched by them, but it's interesting that science is taking DMT so seriously as of late. Joe Rogan must be very proud, because any chance he gets he mentions his DMT experiences. He certainly wouldn't dismiss the alien contact theory. Then there's this theory. Maybe millions of years ago, aliens detected life on a blue planet, the one we call home. They thought, let's send some signals to that place and see what happens. But let's just say that vampire squids and the Gojirasaurus weren't up for chatting. We weren't evolved just yet. We pretty much spent most of our time eating, fighting, procreating, and pooping. The aliens had to wait. So what did they do next? Once they'd been snubbed by basic life on Earth, they sent a probe here and bugged a rock. Why, you might ask? The answer is they wanted to keep an eye on us. Back to the zoo theory thing. The rock they bugged, though, was what was called co-orbital, meaning that it flies around the Earth. If you want a good view of Earth, there's not much point in bugging a rock actually on the planet. A researcher named James Benford, who's also part of the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence group, came up with this idea. Why does he think that? Well, it seems like quite the long shot. Well, it's not that he's certain, but it would make sense. What he's saying is that why not go check out some of those co-orbitals and see if any of them have not been bugged. Another researcher wrote, if it costs very little to go take a look, why not? Even if we don't find ET, we might find something of interest. The closest one is about 38 times further away from Earth than the Moon. We call it the Earth's closest companion, and NASA has said that it's not going anywhere. Well, we mean it's gonna hang around near Earth for centuries to come. That's why some folks are saying we need to do some more extraterrestrial archaeology. Start digging, NASA, because there might be a chance that we're part of an alien-led surveillance state. You might think that it's very hard to send a spacecraft that far, but from what we can see, it's not that hard. In fact, China said it'll send a spacecraft to Earth's closest companion in 2024. The spaceship Chang'e will be equipped with robots that will do a bit of digging around. Maybe they'll come back with some bugs and blow our minds. But if there's a trade war still going on, you can expect the Chinese not to share in the spoils. If in 2025 China suddenly starts speaking alien, you know how it happened. Some of those researchers really do think that those space rocks might be bugged, and they are the best chance we have of finding out if we're in a space zoo. One scientist said, if we don't find anything, that means no one has come to look at life of Earth for over billions of years. That's a big surprise, a stunning thing. When you consider what we've done over our 10,000 plus years of being fairly civilized, imagine what a species could do given a million years. Imagine what we will be capable of in a million years. Yes, we'll be all over the universe. There are things we'll achieve that we can't possibly imagine now. Imagine telling a guy in the dark ages about a show you watch online called The Infographic Show. He could not possibly envision the future, and neither can you. With that in mind, maybe a super civilization did visit us a long time ago. Maybe we're just slow to get out of the blocks. The idea of there being these super civilized space folks has been embraced by a lot of our greatest scientists. Carl Sagan was one of those scientists, and here's a lovely quote from him. The universe is a pretty big place. If it's just us, seems like an awful waste of space. So that's it, really. When you look up into the sky, just imagine someone has been watching us evolve. The big brother who's been around for millions and millions of years saw us crawl out of the swamp. They watched as we stood up and started making spears and drawing pictures of buffalo on cave walls. We hunted and gathered, and a few thousand years later, we started talking about gods that live in the skies. They must have loved that. Then they witnessed endless wars as we struggled to fight over land or which region was the right one. Come on, guys, they thought. It's us, we're your gods, get with the program. They were astounded when we built bombs that could destroy an entire planet. They knew who killed JFK and why those guards were sleeping when Mr. Epstein ran out of air. They're confounded by President Donald Trump's Twitter feed, and they're keeping an eye on you right now as you get to the end of the show. We might also add that while it's very plausible that aliens exist and are watching over us, in terms of scientific proof, well, that's yet to come. The year is 1978 and a small family is pleasure boating in the waters of Loch Ness. The loch is unique amongst freshwater lakes and much deeper than most, reaching as deep as 744 feet in places. It's a long spit of a lake almost 22.5 miles long, yet about 1.5 miles wide. And there's evidence that it once was connected to the ocean. This fact, along with its mysterious depths, have long fueled rumors of a large creature living beneath its icy cold waves. Nessie, as it's taken to be called, has been spotted in the loch for almost 1,500 years. Yet to this family out for a pleasant boat ride, Nessie couldn't be further from their minds. The boat is zipping along the surface of the loch at a dozen miles an hour. The waters are calm today and the sun is high in the sky. It's a perfectly pleasant afternoon to be enjoyed on the water in the rented boat. Then suddenly the boat slams into a massive creature lurking just under the water. The boat is rocked and the engine grinds to a halt. as the propeller is seriously damaged by the creature's body. The family's grandfather, well along in years, looks down into the water and is so terrified by the shock of the accident and what he sees that he immediately suffers a heart attack and collapses. Without a sound, the creature dips down into the depths, and with a broken propeller and ruined engine, the family is left helpless in the middle of the loch. Eventually, other boaters respond to the distress flares being launched by the family. Their boat is towed back to shore and the grandfather rushed to the hospital, where he'll unfortunately be pronounced dead. Rumors begin to circulate that the family encountered the infamous Nessie, and this time there's proof. The family, along with the rescuers who helped drag the boat out of the water, find long strips of flesh caught in the boat's twisted and bent propeller. The owner of the boat rental company described the flesh as long strips of black flesh an inch thick. Finally, physical proof of what may be lurking in the depths of the loch. Unfortunately, when the boat rental company owner returns from consoling the family over their loss, his repair workers have stripped the stricken engine apart and thrown away the fleshy bits back into the water. In a fit of rage, the owner berates the repair workers. The only physical evidence of Nessie is lost forever. This incident occurred in the late 1970s, yet it wasn't the only collision with a large creature in the mysterious Loch Ness that was verified by multiple witnesses. In 1943, a Royal Navy vessel collided with what the boat's commander described as a very large animal, a living creature. In 1952, a man attempting to set a water speed record died when his boat struck a mysterious and very large wake in the middle of the loch. Could it be true then? Could Loch Ness be home to a creature as yet unknown by science? Many scientific and not-so-scientific expeditions have been dispatched to Loch Ness, and the results of similar expeditions to the alleged lake monster locations have encouraged some to believe in the possibility of Nessie. Lake Champlain in Vermont has long been home to a creature known as Champ, the U.S.'s very own lake monster. Evidence of this lake monster, though, has been as frustratingly sketchy as that of Nessie until 2003, when hydrophone operators conducting an extensive underwater survey of the lake discovered something shocking. Originally hired by the Discovery Channel to aid in the filming of a documentary on the Lake Champlain monster, the sonar operators stayed behind after the film crew left to continue their underwater survey. Just a day after the film crew left, the sonar operators picked up an extremely unusual sound, a rapid-fire series of clicks in irregular patterns. The next day, and at a different location, the crew picked up the sound again, and finally a week later they picked it up once more. The recordings at times lasted an incredible 10 minutes, and at one point the operators believed that the creature came as close as 30 feet to the boat. After evaluating the sounds recorded, Elizabeth von Muggenthaler, president of Fauna Communications Research, described them as biosonar of the same type used by whales and dolphins. To her, whatever creature made the sounds was a real living creature and very clearly using sonar to navigate the murky depths of Lake Champlain. She should know, too, as her company specializes in learning how animals communicate with each other, both on land and in the sea. Yet, Lake Champlain has no whales or dolphins and no access to the sea by which a lone whale or dolphin could accidentally wind up in the lake. Though Muggenthaler declined to speculate on how big this creature was or what it was, she made clear that the creature was not a fish, as the recordings were 10 times louder than any fish in the lake, and that it was for sure not a mechanical noise. A born skeptic, Muggenthaler would not go as far to endorse the existence of a lake monster in Lake Champlain, but is sure that her team did not record any known species living in the lake. In Loch Ness, sonar equipment has revealed some interesting and very intriguing finds. In 2014, a ferry captain tracked what appeared to be a very large creature several dozen feet below the waves as his ship made its daily trip across the loch. Accustomed to seeing strange things on the sonar display after years on the lake, this captain said that the image on that particular day very quickly grabbed his and the crew's attention. Unfortunately, due to the murkiness of the loch, they were unable to see anything below them. However, just weeks before this incident, a man had spotted what appears to be a huge creature lurking just beneath the waves of the loch using Apple Maps. This incident eerily repeated itself just this year in August, as 24-year-old Captain Mike Bell was finishing up the history of the Loch Ness monster to his group of tourists. One of them eagerly pointed at his sonar. To Mike and his tourist's surprise, the sonar very clearly showed the blip of one fish 15 meters beneath the boat. Another 20 meters beneath that fish, though, was what appeared to be a solid mass, anywhere from 3 to 8 meters long. Does this prove Nessie's existence, or at least the existence of a large unknown creature in the lake? Well, it's certainly compelling evidence, but as experienced sonar operators know, schools of fish can often clump together so tightly that they resemble one solid mass. The loch is home to 10 different types of fish, and some, like the Atlantic salmon and sea trout, can group together in large schools. In 1975, though, an underwater expedition captured some extraordinary photos that may have hinted at the possibility of Nessie existing. This expedition used cameras sunk at varying depths and rigged to strobe lights to automatically fire when detecting movements. The cameras captured some very extraordinary pictures, including one image which came to be known as the gargoyle head. This photo shows what appears to be a monstrous head, though unfortunately a follow-up expedition in the 80s revisited that same spot and discovered a sunken log that looked exactly like the infamous photo. One of the other photos, however, was not so easily explained. This photo shows what looks like a modern rendition of the pliosaur, a seafaring dinosaur which Nessie is thought to possibly be descended from. While other photos from the expedition were discounted as being random bits of debris caught in the waves, this photo has proved much harder to debunk. One analyst said that based off a similar photo of an eel captured in another lake, and given the estimated distances involved, if this was truly a photo of an eel as skeptics claim, then the head and neck portion in the photo would have been 7.5 feet long. Then there's also the fact that the photo does so very much resemble a pliosaur, replete with long neck and even flippers. When one of the original crew members was questioned about the original photo years later, he said that of all the photos, only this one made him believe they captured something other than a natural phenomenon. Just this summer, a team of scientists from New Zealand initially made headlines when they announced the preliminary discoveries of their DNA study of the loch. After taking over 250 samples in various locations and different depths of the loch, the team looked for DNA in the water shed by its inhabitants. Neil Gemmell, professor of biology and ecology at the University of Otago, New Zealand, told newspapers that after testing each of the main monster hypotheses, they ruled out all but one. Nessie may possibly be a dinosaur after all. According to his original statement, there are a few things that are a bit surprising. After combing through the data, the research team scaled back expeditions dramatically. What they discovered was the presence of about 3,000 species in the loch, ranging from pigs, deer, and humans to the known fish species and thousands of bacteria. What the DNA study did not find was any evidence of a reptilian creature in the loch or of any unknown DNA or reptile cousin. The study found no evidence of crocodiles, lizards, adders, or any other reptilian relatives, though it did find plenty of frogs, toads, and other amphibians. The study did make one very shocking discovery though, and that's the sheer amount of eels in the loch. Everywhere the team tested, they discovered massive amounts of eel DNA, and Professor Gemmell went on to say that he was not sure if the loch was full of a massive amount of eels, more than anybody had ever estimated, or if there was simply a moderate number of very large eels, eels far larger than any known throughout Europe. No giant eels have ever been caught in the loch, however, though if they did exist, then they certainly would account for many of the Nessie sightings, even the ones that we opened this episode with. A propeller could easily shear chunks of flesh off a very large eel, whose skin can sometimes be dark and even black. The European conger eel is the world's largest eel and have been discovered to be as long as 19 feet, growing to a maximum weight of 240 pounds. If conger eels had made their way into the loch, then certainly these monster eels could explain many Nessie sightings. Yet eels tend to stick to the bottom of their habitats, happy to sit down in the murky depths where they hide and search for food. With so many Nessie sightings at the surface, the conger eel is likely not a good match for what people have been seeing, if they've been seeing a creature at all. The DNA study seems to be a nail in Nessie's coffin, conclusively proving that Nessie does not exist. Yet believers have one ray of hope left. The DNA study did not detect the presence of any seals, and yet seals have been routinely discovered in the loch. It's believed that the seals, which are not native to the lake, swim up the river Ness from the ocean, staying in the loch for a few months at a time before making their way back out to open water. Could Nessie thus be doing the same thing? Sadly, with a depth of 30 to 100 centimeters in places, the journey would likely be impossible for an animal as large as Nessie. For those who believe, hope remains that the Loch Ness contains a hidden monster, perhaps a relic from prehistory. Yet modern science is slowly narrowing down on one conclusion, and that is that Nessie likely doesn't exist. Despite this, sightings of the same type of creature have been recorded in the area for almost 2,000 years, and this similarity in stories itself is intriguing evidence to the possibility that Nessie does exist or once existed in the waters of Loch Ness. Deep beneath Yellowstone National Park and its picturesque hot springs lurks a monster of unimaginable proportions, waiting in a very fitful slumber and ready to wipe humanity off the face of the earth. Directly under the national park, one of the most visited in the world, lies a plume of liquid magma 5 miles deep, itself fed by a huge plume of molten rock that boils up from deep beneath the Earth's crust. The churning magma directly beneath Yellowstone is so voluminous that it regularly causes the entire national park to rise and fall by inches at a time. From time to time, the pressure beneath Yellowstone gets to be too much and a volcanic eruption occurs, although overwhelmingly these are relatively minor and are comparable in size to a moderately sized traditional volcano. However, every 600,000 years or so, the pocket of magma beneath Yellowstone builds up so much pressure that the entire park explodes outwards in an incredibly violent event known as a supervolcano eruption. Such an eruption can have widespread consequences for the entire Earth, enveloping the planet in volcanic ash and plummeting global temperatures, causing a small ice age, which can decimate all life. In North America, though extinction is all but guaranteed, we should thank our lucky stars that these super eruptions happen so rarely. Yet today, scientists have confirmed that Yellowstone can and will blow its top in a super eruption by the end of this year, 2019, or at any time in the next 400,000 years. By discovering geological evidence of past Yellowstone eruptions, scientists have been able to pinpoint 3 major eruptions, with the first being 2.1 million years ago, the second 1.3 million years ago, and the third 630,000 years ago. This has led some scientists to predict that Yellowstone is likely to blow again in the next 500,000 years or so, meaning that it could happen as soon as tomorrow. It could happen by the time you finish watching this video, or it could happen later today when you're on your way to the store. Boom! You're trying to buy some snacks and instead you get the extinction of the human race. Point is, Yellowstone is trying to kill all of us and it could happen at literally any time. But as many scientists point out, 3 data points is far from sufficient for establishing a reliable pattern. Right now, Yellowstone seems to have a recurrence interval of between 500,000 and 1 million years, which would put us overdue for a major eruption. Yet with only 3 data points, the previous eruption cycles could have been abnormalities and not an actual pattern. Yellowstone might never explode again, instead maintaining low-level volcanic activity until the North American tectonic plate slides away from the bubble of hot magma under Yellowstone. Or Yellowstone could be waiting for you to fall asleep tonight, to murder you and everyone you love in your sleep. There's just no way to tell with such little data. If or when Yellowstone blows though, it's going to be one for the record books, if there's any humans left alive to keep records. That last eruption 640,000 years ago ejected 1,000 cubic kilometers of material, enough to bury all of Texas 5 feet deep in volcanic ash. By comparison, one of the largest eruptions in the modern age happened when the Novarupta volcano blew its top in 1912, resulting in 13 cubic kilometers of material. That's basically the difference between a hand grenade and a 2,000-pound bunker-busting munition. But what if Yellowstone woke up tomorrow and decided it was sick and tired of all the tourists taking selfies atop its head? What if at last Yellowstone punched our ticket and did its best to wipe out the entire human race? Imagine you're visiting the most famous national park in the world with your family. You're all excited to see Old Faithful because watching hot water shoot up into the air is apparently the neatest thing since sliced bread. Grudgingly, you tag along though, and when you get to the hot springs, you have to admit that they are kind of beautiful. Thanks to specialized bacteria that live in the really acidic and extremely hot water, the springs are colored in a rainbow explosion of colors, and you can't help but snap a selfie up against a backdrop that looks like a giant vomited Skittles all over the landscape. But as you're lining up the perfect selfie, you suddenly feel the ground underneath you start shaking. It's over in a second though, so you figure, whatever, just a small quake. Then, though, there's another mini quake, and then a third. Suddenly, Old Faithful in front of you explodes in a showery display of superheated water. But there's a problem, it's early, like really early. Typically, the park rangers predict when Old Faithful will blow based off the height of the previous eruption and its duration. And it's been just a few minutes, and suddenly, here she is again, spewing hot water 100 feet into the air. Something's not quite right, so you and your family decide to make a semi-calm dash for the car. You're a pretty smart cookie. You do subscribe to the infographic show after all, so you're aware that the swarm of mini-quakes could be bad news. Very bad news. As you start making your way to the park exit, you do some reading up on Yellowstone and come across a host of articles online all saying that there's been a massive amount of earthquakes in the area over the last couple months. What you don't realize, however, is that all of those earthquakes have been the result of a massive bubble of magma, slowly making its way to the surface, riding along that 5-mile plume deep beneath the earth. As the magma was forced upwards, it triggered swarms of earthquakes for months, which all rumbled and shook the rock directly above it, shattering them and paving the way for an eruption. You make it to the park exit, when suddenly there's a major earthquake, much bigger than anything before. To your horror, the earth cracks open all around you, and rivulets of magma start streaming out from several dozen places around the park. The road you're on splits and cracks, leaving impassable crevices and holes. Cars are officially useless, so you do what seems like the logical thing and get out and start running. You're not sure where exactly to run, but your brain has a pretty good idea that away is as good a direction as any. As you pump your feet though, the earth rumbles one final time, and suddenly, the Yellowstone caldera explodes outward, no longer able to resist the incredible pressures building from below. For you, the story is over here. If you're caught in the actual explosion, then your body, down to the bones, will become part of the giant ash cloud belching up into the sky. Magma up to 2400 degrees incinerates your body, but not before superheated and very toxic gases that envelop you fry your lungs to carbon. Death is instantaneous, with the incredible heat boiling your brain in milliseconds and causing your skull to explode outwards from the buildup of steam. Congratulations, because you're officially one of the lucky ones. For the rest of us, Yellowstone has a much longer, lingering death in store. Volcanic explosions rock an area of about 40 miles or so, ejecting millions of tons of lava. Volcanic ash, made up of pulverized rock and jagged shards of glass, makes its way into the atmosphere, where the winds begin to spread it around the surrounding countryside in an almost perfect umbrella shape. Over the next few weeks, a whopping 240 cubic miles of ejecta is spit out by the Yellowstone volcano, though only about a third of it makes it into the atmosphere. That's more than enough, however, to bury the entirety of the northern Rockies in an astonishing 3 feet of ash. Wyoming, Idaho, Colorado, Montana, and Utah are all paralyzed by the extremely acidic ash. Residents of these states will begin to die by the thousands due to the inhalation of ash, which fills the lungs and suffocates, but also cuts and lacerates the lungs and trachea thanks to the very sharp and jagged particles of glass. Venting of highly noxious gases across the 40-mile eruption zone also spreads suffocating and toxic gases across hundreds of miles of terrain, making its way into the underground shelters of the few survivors who lived through the initial explosion. Hydrogen sulfide and other gases kill tens of thousands in their sleep, silently suffocating victims. 3 feet of ash also paralyze industry and travel. Roads are impassable, and the very fine ash wreaks havoc in vehicles, damaging electronics and gumming up even the most robust engines. Emergency services are effectively shut down, and air travel in the region is impossible. Anyone caught in the area of the northern Rockies is doomed, with no hope for escape. To make matters worse, the ash also wends its way into rivers and lakes, even down to the subsurface aquifers, where it poisons the water. Millions of thirsty survivors are forced to drink brackish water, which slowly poisons them, killing them in a matter of weeks or even days. In a few days, the ash clouds move over the Midwest and lay down thick carpets of black ash half a foot thick. By day 4 of the eruption, no air travel across the heart of the United States is possible. And here too, the ash paralyzes all forms of ground transportation as well. Power plants shut down, their equipment damaged by the ash clouds, or starved of the oil and gas they need to operate, thanks to a nationwide traffic shutdown. To make matters worse, the Midwest grows the majority of the U.S.'s crops, and the thick ash suffocates all vegetation. Here too, the ash poisons water supplies, and clean drinking water becomes an extreme rarity. By the end of the week, an inch or two of ash has fallen on both the east and west coast. Despite being so close to Yellowstone, prevailing wind patterns have prevented much of the ash from making its way to California and other west coast states, although now they find themselves with 2 inches of dangerous volcanic ash. The fine particles wreak havoc on electronics, and much of America's modern infrastructure is destroyed. Just about every drinking source in the United States is contaminated to some degree, and FEMA rushes to try and provide decontamination kits to a surviving population of 300 million. The rest of the world breathes a sigh of relief. They have, after all, avoided the biggest bullet in the history of mankind. Yet, what they don't realize is that the Yellowstone eruption has put millions upon millions of tons of sulfur aerosols into the atmosphere, and these begin to reflect sunlight back into space. Within weeks, the entire planet is wrapped in a cloak of sulfuric particles, and so much sunlight is being reflected back into space that global temperatures drop by a degree. At first, the planet barely notices the temperature drop, helping to stabilize global warming trends thanks to mankind's carbon emissions. But over the following weeks, the temperature drops even more. The Pinatubo eruption in 1991 cooled the planet by 0.7 degrees, and the Tambora eruption of 1815 led to what was termed the Year Without Summer, causing widespread crop failures. Yellowstone's eruption is many times greater than either of those two, and now temperatures drop so low that winter officially lasts for 80 years, a prediction based off the effects of 2 previous eruptions. Mankind digs in for an 80-year Game of Thrones LARP event, because winter is officially here, and it's not leaving for 8 decades. Some regions of the planet may remain habitable, and crops may be sustainable in small numbers along the equatorial regions of the planet. However, the vast majority of humanity will die off, and those that survive will quickly learn to stay out of direct sunlight no matter how cold they are. Thanks to those same sulfuric aerosols that brought us seasons 9 through 89 of Game of Thrones, the ozone layer is so damaged that harmful UV radiation bakes the planet, causing sunburn within minutes. Eventually, the ozone layer will restore itself and the environment will return to a normal state. But in all likelihood, both of those things will happen far too late for our technologically dependent species to survive. Yet it's important to remember that, terrifying as this scenario is, scientists are reasonably sure that there's little reason to worry, as Yellowstone may never erupt again, or it could erupt tonight while you're sleeping. Like we said, there's just not enough data points to know for sure. In 1969, the American Army Corps of Engineers did something incredible. They drained Niagara Falls. When the water slowed to a trickle and the rocks that had been hidden underwater for thousands of years could be seen, the engineers found something both shocking and horrifying. Lying on the riverbed were millions of coins. As they explored the exposed bedrock further, they stumbled across human remains. Now engineers want to drain the falls once again, and what they might find could shock the world. In the coming years, the waters on the American side of Niagara Falls will be diverted to the Canadian side, and the rock bed will be exposed. In 1969, researchers needed to explore the riverbed and examine the walls of the river to identify points of erosion and better understand the rock composition of the area. This time around, engineers are going to take the opportunity of a drained Niagara Falls to repair bridges that have been in use for over a century. There are 2 parts to this story. The first has to do with the amazing feat of engineering used to drain a waterfall that dumps thousands of gallons of water every second into the river below. The second has to do with the mysterious objects found under the water of Niagara Falls once it was drained. The official term for this process is dewatering. The first and only time thus far that Niagara Falls had been dewatered was on June 13, 1969, a month before Apollo 11 landed on the moon. People flocked to Niagara Falls from around the country to see the naked riverbed. To be clear, there are 3 main waterfalls in the area. The largest sits on the Canadian side of the border and is known as Horseshoe Falls. This part of Niagara Falls has never been dewatered and probably never will be, as it unleashes an enormous amount of water every second. Here, the water drops 165 feet and accounts for 85% of the river's flow. The falls on the American side are much smaller and therefore easier to divert water from. These waterfalls are named American Falls and Bridal Veil Falls. When these 2 waterfalls were stopped in 1969, the rock faces stood between 70 and 100 feet tall. It was this image that thousands of people came to see. Pictures were snapped and headlines were made. The engineers didn't so much stop the flow of water as divert it. They built a temporary 600-foot dam across the Niagara River which diverted 60,000 gallons of water every second toward Horseshoe Falls. This temporarily increased the already enormous amount of water flowing over the falls, making it an even more spectacular sight to behold. When the water was drained, the engineers were amazed by how many coins were lying on the riverbed. They were collected, but records do not indicate where the money actually ended up. Even more surprising were the two sets of human remains that were recovered during this time. One belonged to a man, another a woman. Everybody from a known accident at the falls had been recovered, so authorities could only scratch their heads and wonder who these two sets of remains belonged to. Although deaths at Niagara Falls were nothing new, especially when people had been making bad decisions and doing crazy things near the landmark since the 1800s. On July 19, 1853, Joseph Avery and two other men had been working off the shore of Goat Island. The men had been drinking and made some questionable decisions when it came time to return to the mainland. Avery and the other two workers hopped into a rowboat and started to drunkenly paddle back to the mainland. Only moments after pushing it off into the turbulent waters, the boat capsized, throwing the men into the raging river. Avery watched in horror as his two friends were dragged toward the American Falls and disappeared over the edge. Avery was able to grab onto a thicket of tree roots and held on for dear life as his friends plummeted to their deaths. 18 hours went by before any help arrived. When someone discovered that there was a man hanging onto tree roots in the middle of Niagara River, they sent for help. A rescue team was dispatched and made their way across the river to rescue Avery, but the current was too strong and the rescue team couldn't reach him without being swept over the side of the falls. Then someone had an idea. They tethered a boat to Goat Island and slowly released rope so they could control their descent down the river. They reached Avery, who was desperate to get out of the water by any means necessary. He was clearly only moments away from losing his grip and going over the falls. The boat reached Avery, but as he scrambled to climb in, the turbulence caused the entire vessel to capsize. Avery was thrown back into the raging water, swept downriver, and plunged over the falls. Even after struggling to survive all night and almost an entire day, Joseph Avery died on the American side of Niagara Falls. After his death, the rock that he clung to was given the name Avery's Rock. But not everyone who goes over the falls dies. In fact, some people chose to go over Niagara Falls for some pretty crazy reasons. On October 24, 1901, Annie Edson Taylor became the first person to go over the falls in a wooden barrel and survive. The emphasis here is that she was the first person to go over Niagara Falls in a wooden barrel and live, because 2 days before, Annie set her cat over the waterfall to see if it would survive. The cat lived, which convinced Annie that she would as well. Annie was a school teacher who was struggling to make ends meet like most teachers. She came up with a foolproof plan to become famous, which would inevitably make her rich. On her 63rd birthday, Annie climbed inside a wooden barrel and went over Niagara Falls while hundreds of people looked on. The wooden barrel had an air hole drilled in it so she could still breathe while inside. Annie was sealed in and the barrel was sent over the river. People watched as the barrel bobbed up and down in the swiftly moving water. Then Annie and the barrel disappeared over the falls. It landed in the white water with a thunk. When the barrel was recovered, Annie was found alive with a few bumps and bruises but otherwise physically unharmed. However, her plan was shattered when she wasn't swarmed by fans. Annie received almost no proceeds from her stunt, and when she passed away from natural causes, her funeral had to be paid for by public donations. But the fact remains that Annie Edson Taylor was and will always be the first person to ever survive going over Niagara Falls in a barrel. And that brings us back to the dewatering of Niagara Falls. Joseph Avery was not the last person to be tragically swept over the falls, and not everyone was as lucky as Annie Edson Taylor when trying daredevil stunts at Niagara Falls. Therefore, it wasn't surprising that when water was diverted from the American side of the falls, bodies were found. The first body belonged to a female. She had decomposed and only her bones remained. The entire research project was halted as investigative teams were brought in to preserve the remains and identify who they belonged to. The team removed the skeleton and took it back to the lab for analysis. The recovery of the remains was a success, but the identification of who they belonged to was not. To this day, we still don't know whose bones were found when the American side of Niagara Falls was drained. But this isn't the most gruesome story to come out of the draining of Niagara Falls in 1969. When the water stopped flowing and the research teams began their work, something horrifying happened. As researchers and engineers worked in the dried riverbed and people flocked from around the country to see a dry waterfall, a man walked up to the newly exposed rock face and fell. Several witnesses saw the man fall and land somewhere in the rocks below. Rescue teams were sent to find the man. It took several days, but eventually the body was recovered and work could once again resume on the dried riverbed of Niagara Falls. There were also less gruesome things found when the water was diverted from American and Bridevale Falls in 1969. Millions and millions of coins were uncovered by the research teams and brought out of the riverbed. These coins were mainly from the United States and Canada, but other currencies were also retrieved. Now that there are plans in place to drain the American side of Niagara Falls once again, many people are wondering what objects will be uncovered under its waters. It's been over 50 years since it was last drained, and during that time we've developed cell phones, drones, and cameras. All of these objects will likely be found wedged in the rocks of Niagara Riverbed, along with more coins. Although there are no known missing bodies from people who have gone over the falls, it's still within the realm of possibility that human remains could be found. Accidents happen all the time, and people might be traveling alone when they disappeared. Only time will tell if more human remains will need to be exhumed from the riverbed of Niagara Falls, and who knows what other objects might be found once the waters of Niagara cease to flow.
Why would a man of sound mind and body decide to inject himself with a 3.5 million year old virus that he found in the Siberian mountains? Not any man, but a man of science and understanding. One day, this insane academic decided to load up a syringe of the ancient bacteria and inject himself with it. Why? What would compel such a person to do such a thing? Well, the scientist in question, Anatoly Brushkov, figured that whatever had kept those bacteria alive for 3.5 million years might also keep human life alive just as long. And since 2009, his plan has succeeded. And what's more, Brushkov has been in the best health he has ever been in. Today, we look deep into the science behind that old virus in order to find out exactly what is going on. In this episode of the Infographic Show, why would a scientist inject himself with a 3.5 million year old bacteria? Anatoly Brushkov, head of the geocryology department at Moscow State University, discovered the bacteria in 2009. The virus was embedded in an ancient permafrost site called Mammoth Mountain in the Sakha Republic, otherwise known as the Yakutia region in Siberia. A similar bacterium was found by scientist Vladimir Repin in the brain of an ice-preserved woolly mammoth. Although the virus was trapped in the ice, it was still alive after all those years, and this is of interest to many scientists. What has kept it alive for so long? Brushkov and his team were determined to find out. Experiments began. Mice injected with Bacillus F were able to reproduce at an age older than regular mice typically reproduce, suggesting that Bacillus F may have potential as a longevity serum. But the experiments didn't stop with pregnant granny rodents. Oh no, Brushkov also experimented with fruit flies with positive results. Even plants exposed to the bacteria thrived for an unusually long length of time. Brushkov confirmed in an interview for Russian TV that he needed to extend the experiment to human subjects, namely himself. Since injecting himself with the virus, his general health and well-being have improved dramatically. I've started to work longer, he said. I haven't had the flu for the last 2 years. After successful experiments on mice and fruit flies, I thought it would be interesting to try the inactivated bacterial culture. The scientist continued, the permafrost is thawing, and I guess these bacteria get into the environment, into the water, so the local population, the Yakut people in fact, for a long time are getting these cells with water and even seem to live longer than some other nations. So there was no danger for me, but we do not know how it works. In fact, we do not know exactly how aspirin works, for example, but it does. The same is true here. We cannot understand the mechanism, but we see the impact. Perhaps there were some side effects, but there should be some special medical equipment to spot them. Of course, such experiments need to be conducted in a clinic, with special equipment and statistics. Then we could say clearly about all the effects. If we find how the bacteria stay alive, we probably would be able to find a tool to extend our own lives. Yakutsk epidemiologist Dr. Viktor Chernyavsky added, the bacteria gives out biologically active substances throughout its life, which activates the immune status of experimental animals. If the same substance were to be given to people, it could cause a significant improvement in their health, leading to the discovery of an elixir of life. So by making himself the human guinea pig in this experiment, Brushkov hopes to find out more about longevity. And who knows, in the process, he may end up becoming one of the oldest scientists himself. 3 different strains of bacteria exist in the permafrost, and Brushkov is determined to find out how the bacteria protect themselves against cell damage. Brushkov speculates that immortal bacteria probably exist somewhere in the world, and that such bacteria protect themselves from dying. Somewhere within the virus, he feels, the secret must be hidden. His team has completed deciphering the Bacillus F DNA, but now faces the complicated task of figuring out which genes are responsible for the longevity of the virus. The isolation of this gene would be the key to unlocking the puzzle, perhaps to eternal life. But even if he doesn't find the secret of everlasting life, Brushkov has stumbled into a remarkable new field. Discovering the mechanism behind the vitality of the virus could have significant health implications for humankind. If we can find how the bacteria stays alive, then we will be able to find the cure to prolong our own life, Brushkov concluded. Brushkov isn't the only scientist experimenting with ancient bacteria. For years, scientists have been examining the bacteria from the Siberian mountains and beyond. There's still much to learn about viruses and the hundreds of protein-encoding genes. Scientists are always looking to nature for clues as to how to improve human health. In February 2018, an article published by the New Atlas magazine looked at the mole rat. This mammal lives well into its 30s, and it's pretty much immune to all types of cancer and can do without oxygen for long lengths of time. Perhaps if scientists can pull apart the cell structure of this mammal, a secret to its longevity may be unraveled. There are bound to be, as Brushkov suggests, many more secrets out there in nature. These secrets may lead to humankind living a much longer and healthier life.
What if we were to find a cure for brain cancer? And what if that cure were to be found in a common mosquito-carried virus? Well, it looks like that might just have happened. A team of researchers from the Texas Medical Branch have made a breakthrough discovery and reckon they may have found the perfect weapon in the brain cancer-killing arsenal. University of Texas Medical Branch, led by geneticist Pai-Young Shi, successfully killed off a bunch of stem cells that allow brain tumors to stay alive and healthy in mice. So in theory, if this research is continued, the team may develop a remedy to fight aggressive forms of brain cancer in humans. Let's see how the team came to their conclusions, as today on the infographic show we look deep into medical science as we find out exactly why scientists are turning Zika virus into a weapon against brain cancer. First up, just what exactly is Zika? Well, Zika is a viral disease named after the Zika forest in Uganda, where the virus was first discovered and isolated in 1947. The virus is a member of the Flaviviridae family and is spread by day-active mosquitoes such as A. aegypti and A. albopictus. This virus is related to yellow fever, Japanese encephalitis, dengue, and the West Nile virus. Post-1950, it had been known to be active along an equatorial strip across Asia and Africa. Come 2007 to 2016, the virus spread eastward across the Pacific Ocean to the Americas, leading to an epidemic between 2015 and 2016. Symptoms of the viral infection, or Zika fever, are similar to a mild form of dengue fever. These symptoms include a sudden high fever, headaches, a pain behind the eyes, joint and muscle pain, fatigue, and nausea. Like dengue, there is no specific treatment apart from paracetamol or aspirin, and lots of time. Since around 2015, huge outbreaks of Zika have ravaged South and Central America. The epidemic caused by the Zika virus in Brazil spread to other parts of South and North America, along with several islands in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. In January 2016, the World Health Organization claimed the virus was likely to spread further, but in November they announced the end of the Zika epidemic. The outbreak gave scientists reason to look at the virus more closely. It was discovered that the virus could cause serious birth defects in infants whose mothers were infected while carrying them in pregnancy. These defects include blindness, deformed limbs, and a condition known as microcephaly, being born with a smaller than normal skull. All these deformities appeared to emerge from the viral brain damage caused by Zika. Zika likes to infect a fetus brain cell known as the neural progenitor cell, killing off the growth and development of these cells into fully functioning mature neurons. It occurred to the team that perhaps Zika's selective appetite could be manipulated into a more beneficial use since it's designed to attack selective brain cells. The most aggressive type of brain cancer is known as glioblastoma multiforme, or GBM, and is almost impossible to cure with a survival rate of just 5%. There is no clear method to prevent the disease, and treatment typically involves chemotherapy, radiation therapy, and surgery. Despite these treatments, this type of cancer normally recurs. It's not known if it's better to remove the entire tumor or part of it. A typical survival period once diagnosis is made is usually 12 to 15 months with treatment and around 3 months without treatment. It's the most common cancer that begins life in the brain, and after meningioma, is the second most common brain cancer around. 3 in every 100,000 people develop GBM each year. It's more common in males than females and usually appears when the host is around 64 years of age. It's understood by some in the medical profession that GBM uses glioma stem cells to rebuild their stock. These cells are remarkably similar to the fetal brain cells that Zika attacks, so she and the Texas team of researchers put 2 and 2 together and made plans to begin some research. And so the experiments began. The team put their theory to the test by injecting Zika straight into the brains of cancerous mice. They were encouraged to find that the experiment seemed to prove their theory. The procedure prolonged the lives of the infected mice, but the test group was rather small. The team tested the virus on 18 mice with the glioblastomas GBM and compared the results with 15 injected with a saline control substance. After a period of 2 weeks, the tumors in the Zika-infected mice had shrunken. The team's idea was workable, and the research continues. In September 2018, Paiyong Shi commented, "These findings represent major progress toward developing the Zika vaccine as a safe and effective viral therapeutic treatment for human glioblastoma." Now, you might be a bit reluctant to have a known dangerous virus injected directly into your brain, and a bit wary of the damage it could likely cause. But faced with GBM, it is a risk most patients would be willing to take. There is much research to be completed before Zika can be considered a viable option for cancer patients. But the fact that it attacks those rare adult cells is a relatively good start. This different and unconventional approach to treating brain cancer is a testament that creativity is alive and well in the scientific medical research. When most of us picture the man known as Thor, it's likely the image we pull up is that of pretty boy Chris Hemsworth. His depiction is not far off the real deal, and if you look for old images of the Norse god online, you'll find most are of a handsome, muscular man with rather beautiful long hair. And yep, the old school Thor was also quite fond of a certain hammer. We have the movie version of this man, and we have the comic version too. But what about the real Thor? Did such a man really exist? We can trace Thor back to Germanic mythology, and the character was pretty much like the one we see today in the Marvel movies. Thor has always been the god of thunder, and he always carried the most fearsome weapon known to man. That hammer is called Mjolnir. As with most stories belonging to what we call mythology, there are many spins on the tales. The Norse people were spread out over Scandinavia and beyond, and so the tales tended to be varied. Thor himself is said to have had about 15 names. One thing that doesn't change is that he is the god of thunder and has tremendous strength. His father is Odin and his mother is Jora, although you might find she has different names too. But the question we all want to know is, was Thor real? Some of you might scoff at this question, but let's remember there are a lot of people in this world that believe in gods, and some of those people believe in miracles which to some extent are superpowers. Look around you. There are places of worship everywhere. We swear on the Bible in courts. We sing songs about heaven. We watch people being healed on cable TV when we can't sleep at 4 o'clock in the morning. And in the past, some of those Norse pagans also took their gods seriously. They did not just marvel at the heroics contained in the stories. They actually believed that Thor and his family were real. In the spirit of open-mindedness, we might say it sounds a little unfair if someone claims that their god is real but the other person's is just plain silly. And so today, we're taking our superhero seriously. During our research, we found a media story with this title: Swedish archaeologists find Thor's hammer. The engineer who found it said, "I at first thought it was piping sticking out of the ground." So, wow, isn't that amazing? Well, not quite so, because the article was written on April 1st, and there's no corroborating evidence. You can actually find quite a lot of articles that tell the reader Thor's hammer had been discovered. But these stories only seem to appear in the British tabloid media, and some of those newspapers could be said to have juggled with the truth on occasions. In the USA, Fox News reported in 2018 that the hammer had been discovered in Iceland, but what was found was really only a tiny amulet. There must have been lots of these around in the past. Thor's hammer was a special pagan symbol, and there were images of it everywhere in those days around Scandinavia and beyond. One of the UK's more creative media companies, called the Daily Mail, also said that the hammer had been found, but this time in 2014, and the site was in Denmark. The Mail writes, "Archaeologists have unearthed a 10th century Thorshammer in Kolbeløv on the Danish island of Lolland that could finally end the debate on how Thor's legend influenced Viking jewelry." The paper does say, though, that thousands of such things resembling a little hammer amulet have been found all over the place. Imagine if in 1,000 years someone digs up a Christian cross and says, "Hey dudes, this is the cross on which that guy Jesus died." It shrunk over time, of course. So with that in mind, we can say that finding a hammer symbol doesn't mean Thor existed. but it does show how many people believed in him. In fact, the Christian cross is often compared to Thor's hammer, in that the hammer was also a small symbol you'd find in many people's pockets and in their houses. That's because the powerful symbol represented not only thunder and storms and lightning, but also the protection of mankind, healing and fertility. Oh, and oak trees, we shouldn't forget them. Belief in such gods goes a long way back, and you can find ancient Roman manuscripts that talk about the gods of the Germanic peoples. Thor and his hammer have been compared to Hercules and his club. Of course, some people might have found this superstitious, but many others were happy to roll with powerful men who wielded magic weapons. In the 8th century, there's evidence that the Saxon people believed in Thor, with some guy in a hammer turning up in poetry. This is called a possible version of Thor because there are many stories in many languages and dialects. The Christians, of course, were having none of it, telling those pagan fools that no such gods existed. Balderdash, they might have said. There's only one true god and it's ours. In the 11th century, if you told a Viking what he could do with his hammer, you might have gotten your eyes removed. In fact, there's evidence that in 1030 an English preacher told some Vikings his version of Thor, and for that they lynched him from a tree. Those Vikings, we believe, were not what you might call an inclusive horde. Yet in the end, nearly all converted to Christianity, so maybe one god was more real than the other in the end. While there are stories of such gods going back to ancient times, it seems we got many more stories in the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries. This is called the Viking Age and post-Viking Age. Word spread, of course, because the Vikings liked to move around a lot. They successfully plundered parts of England back then, and at first burned down churches and laughed at the English people's pitiful god. A god with a skinny son that wasn't interested in martial arts and rather large house tools. Still, Christianity won many converts, and that became the go-to religion for many people in Europe. Heathens were pretty much outlawed. Those hammer symbols were taken off the living room wall and replaced with crosses. The symbolic expression of power was replaced with a symbol of sacrifice. Who knows? It could have gone the other way, and instead of sitting in front of a giant cross holding up a bloody JC on Sunday, we could have been staring up at a muscular blonde guy wielding a massive hammer. Early Thor-based poems have been uncovered and then translated into English. Many of these poems involve a beast getting his behind kicked. This is part of one of those poems. Against the serpent goes Othin's son. In anger smites the warder of earth. Thor, of course, hands that serpent a good old-fashioned whooping. We could go on because there are lots of stories, or what we might call sagas, just as every religion had its stories. Did Thor beat up that serpent in real life, you might ask? Well, you could also ask if St. George slayed a dragon, if Moses parted the Red Sea, or if there was a forbidden tree in the Garden of Eden. And on that tree were some pretty irresistible-looking apples. What we're trying to say, of course, is that Thor existed for some people, and he might still exist now for some people. All we have to go on are stories, because all history is a story. We cannot possibly tell you the immutable truth because we weren't there. We can only speculate or have faith. On that rationale, you could say Thor is as real as Jesus Christ, Allah, Shiva, Abraham, or that dragon which St. George put in its place. If this insults you, we only want to point out that some of those Norse people took their gods seriously just as you do now. The tales were just overtaken over a long period of time. The pagans and their rituals were replaced with churches and new books of high truths. These days, many devout people don't actually take everything in those books literally. Some do, but others will tell you that the tales serve merely as metaphors. Some of those pagans might not have believed in the man and god called Thor, but they had faith in what he represented. That was protection and, importantly, fertility, because everyone needed crops to grow to survive. We're all familiar with the moon. It hangs in the sky above our heads most nights, and you probably know it well enough to recognize the ever-famous face of the man on the moon. Yet the moon is tidally locked on the Earth, meaning that it takes the moon as long to rotate on its axis as it takes to orbit the Earth, about 27 days. This is why when you look up into the sky night after night, the moon always looks the same. This leaves the dark side of the moon, or the side not visible to us, as somewhat of a mystery to most people. And just recently, that mystery deepened. Today, we're taking a look at this massive moon mystery in giant mass discovered on the far side of the moon. On July 20th, 1969, the world held its breath as two American astronauts began their descent to the lunar surface. Packed inside a lander the size of a large closet, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin slowly eased their vessel, the Eagle, to the surface below. The moon had previously been explored remotely by telescope and moon probes, but people were still unsure what the conditions on the surface were like. Some feared that the lander would come down on ground that was nothing more than loose soil, and the entire spacecraft would be swallowed up as if it had fallen into quicksand. As the Eagle slowly descended, millions of Americans and millions more of Earth's citizens around the world all held their breath, watching the greatest accomplishment in human history unfold on their television screens, unsure if they would be watching a mighty triumph or a horrible catastrophe. Eventually, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin made their safe landing, and a half hour later, they stuck the American flag on the soil that was loose yet still firm enough to safely stand on. Their initial explorations of the moon and the following Apollo missions all revealed a lunar landscape made up of a thick layer of loose and very fine dust, but with solid crust underneath, the result of lava flows and the impact of tens of thousands of asteroids. With an interest in one day building a lunar base, which could serve as a jumping-off point for manned missions deeper into the solar system, NASA began to study the composition of the moon in detail. Yet, interest waned as the American manned space program got stuck in lower Earth orbit for the last 50 years. Today, though, there is once again talk at NASA of returning to the moon, with plans to put the first woman on the moon in 2024 as part of NASA's growing push to put humans deeper into space than ever before, and one day in the 2030s on the surface of Mars itself. This has created a need for updated maps and geographical knowledge of the moon, a task which various international probes and orbiters have been tackling for the last few years. NASA's astronauts will eventually build a manned lab on the moon from which to conduct research and even mine for fuel and other resources that are too cost-prohibitive to put into orbit from Earth. This means that we need to know as much about the moon as possible long before the first humans go back. It was in one such recent preparatory study that a stunning anomaly was discovered on the dark side of the moon, lurking just below the lunar surface, with its face permanently turned away from us. The dark side of the moon is the least understood by the general public, and has fueled conspiracy theories for decades. Everything from an alien base to crashed alien spaceships to a secret joint American and Russian base have all been claimed to exist on the side of the moon we never get to see from Earth. And while no nation's spacecraft have ever discovered any of these things, what they have discovered recently hints at a massive mystery with no clear answer. The anomaly was discovered in early April of this year and consists of a titanic mass of material that initially had scientists staring at their data in disbelief. Located just beneath the largest surviving impact crater in the solar system, the moon's South Pole Aitken Basin is a mass of material lurking just beneath the lunar surface that's suspected to be metal from an asteroid that crashed into the moon billions of years ago. Data shows that the buried anomaly is a mass of metal roughly 5 times bigger than the island of Hawaii, and the crater itself is 1,243 miles wide. That's the distance from Waco, Texas to Washington, D.C. The crater is also several miles deep, and the weight of this mysterious mass is so great that it actually drags down the basin floor by as much as a half a mile. Scientists speculate that the mass is the result of the initial impact and contains most of the asteroid's metal core. If so, then this impact must have been titanic indeed, and would have been without a doubt a life killer for anything crawling around on the Earth a few billion years ago. While the impact is estimated to have been about 4 billion years ago, it's believed that life got its start on Earth 3.5 billion years ago. At least that's how far back the fossil record has taken us. Perhaps life was around when this massive impact happened, and if so, then we might owe our very survival to the moon being a real class act and taking one for the team. Other scientists, however, are skeptical of the mystery mass really being the surviving core of a huge asteroid, as it would be extremely unlikely that so much of it would survive impact and then stay relatively put for billions of years. Instead, they believe that the mystery mass is nothing more than dense oxides created during the last stage of lunar magma ocean solidification. This would have taken place approximately around the same time as the asteroid impact, and as a result of the moon finally cooling off from its violent birth as the remains of a planetoid impact with the young Earth. For many millions of years, the heat of the impact was trapped inside the dense core of the moon, much like in the Earth, and kept heated by the decay of radioactive elements. Eventually, though, as the moon cooled, its volcanic activity ceased, and its oceans of magma solidified into the crust we see today, and that US astronauts played golf on 5 decades ago. The giant mystery mass would thus be nothing more than the anomalous but perfectly natural aggregation of really dense oxides that were trapped by the cooling lava over 100 miles beneath the surface. Sadly, without a return to the moon, we won't be solving this mystery anytime soon, and we'll have to speculate on the real nature and origin of this massive moon mystery for at least 5 more years to come, if NASA's budget isn't pulled again. However, conspiracy theorists have wasted no time in jumping into the mystery and have already offered a dozen explanations for the anomalous mass lurking beneath the surface, everything from a buried kaiju to, you guessed it, alien bases. Personally, the alien hypothesis is the one that's most exciting because, to be honest, the universe seems like a really big but really lonely place. It would be nice if we had next-door neighbors all this time, and getting to know an alien civilization would give us a great comparison point to our own. To know ourselves, we must first know others. Only then can we find out what's really unique and extraordinary about humanity. Or perhaps we're just painting a rosy picture to get your guard down, because we here at the Infographics Show secretly worship our alien overlords from Zeta Reticuli, who have built a moon base from which to eventually invade Earth and eat your delicious brains. It's the middle of the night and you find yourself needing to get up out of bed and go to the bathroom. You're still half asleep as you do your business and then finish on the toilet and go to wash your hands in the sink. Your view is slightly blurry through your sleep-crusted eyes, but something alerts your attention to the reflection in the mirror. You see what looks like a speck on the wall behind you. You wipe your eyes to see more clearly, horrified when you realize that the speck is a cockroach. At once, you're startled by the sight of it, grossed out and disgusted. It's obscene and enough to make your skin crawl. For most of us, bugs, especially cockroaches, are just plain nasty to have around the house. If you live with cockroaches, you may feel the immediate need to use insecticide to poison them. Scientists have recently reported, however, that this approach will not work because, like it or not, roaches are highly adept at survival. How are they able to survive so well? And is there any effective way to get rid of them? In any given population of roaches, there may be one or two or more that possess an immunity to an insecticide. So let's say you go and spray a group of them with the toxins and all but a few of them drop dead. The ones that died were susceptible to the chemicals and did not live to pass on their genes. The survivors, however, are free to continue living, and they pass on their insecticide-resistant genes to their offspring. So the next time you use insecticide on them, only a few unlucky susceptible roaches actually die from it. This is because the population has become impervious thanks to those hardy survivors from the initial treatment, who went on to create more immune roaches. Before you know it, you have an epidemic on your hands that insecticide won't help you with. Cockroaches as a species are 300-million-year-old insects. They've been around for a very, very long time and are not likely to disappear anytime soon. They may even inherit the Earth following a nuclear disaster. After the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, it was mentioned that cockroaches were among the Japanese city's only survivors. These incredibly tough little creatures simply refused to go down without a fight. So perhaps you're thinking now that you might as well give up on trying to get rid of them. Maybe instead of fighting that next roach by spraying poison on it, you should give it a name and buy it a diamond-studded collar with a leash to take it out on walks. After all, if you can't get rid of them, you may as well derive some sort of companionship out of the situation, right? Walking your pet roach would be an interesting conversation starter with anyone that you pass along the street. Perhaps you could even use it as an icebreaker to help you speak with your crush. But be warned that in all likelihood, she might be more creeped out than impressed by your little friend. Before you decide you need to go home and feed your new pet cockroach, you may want to consider that not only are they gross to look at, they're also bad for your health. As disgusting as it sounds, roaches shed tiny bits of dust from their bodies, and this dust is an allergen that can provoke or worsen symptoms of asthma. They also carry pathogens like Salmonella and E. coli. So unlike with a dog or cat, when your pet cockroach sheds, it has the added risk of making you sick. With this in mind, it can be stated with a certain degree of confidence that these creepy crawlers are not good to have around. So then how do you get rid of them? Is the situation as hopeless as it may seem? Maybe not. Rather than using poison as your method of choice for eliminating these pests, physically removing them may provide you with a better long-term solution. This includes using special vacuums to suck up the little monsters. You can also lay down sticky traps to capture them. To further combat against having roaches in your home, you should also make sure that you don't leave anything out that may be tempting them to stick around. For instance, make sure you take out your trash once a day. Leaving out your leftover pizza delivery boxes from last night or 2 nights ago might create a Disney World for the roaches, enticing them to view your house as their own personal paradise. So make sure to be clean and tidy so as not to make it easier for them. Also, it's advisable not to leave out any pet food for too long. We mean regular pet food like for your dog or cat, not for your pet roach. Though we'd assume with a certain level of common sense that roach food, whatever that might look like, would also prompt them to stay. So for the sake of keeping the little creatures away, don't leave anything edible lying around the house for too long. If you do all of these things and you still can't seem to get rid of them, the situation might not be as completely hopeless as it seems. Though they are quick at developing resistance to insecticides, they may also be quick to develop susceptibility to them. Since roaches only live for about 100 days and have many offspring, it may only take a few generations for them to re-evolve susceptibility to insecticide. This means that if you take a break from using it for a while, the chemicals may become effective at killing them once again. So you may not necessarily have to give up those use of insecticides entirely. Just do your homework and be mindful about when and how often you use it. In order to test the true levels of their resiliency, a study was conducted on German cockroaches whereby they were subjected to different levels of radioactive metal cobalt-60. This experiment was meant to test these insects' limit as applied to any potential future nuclear war. The results confirmed that these critters can indeed survive a nuclear explosion, but that they're not as impervious as we might have previously imagined. Yes, they can survive a nuclear explosion, but only to a certain extent. Though a whopping 10% of cockroaches were able to survive exposure to 370,000 becquerels per meter cubed of cobalt-60, none survived exposure to 3.7 million becquerels per meters cubed. To put this into better perspective, 3,700 becquerels per meters cubed of cobalt-60 is enough to kill a person in 10 minutes. So how do these tiny bugs manage to outlive us in such conditions? Scientists attribute the cockroaches' survivability to their simple bodies. Their cell cycles are also slower than a human's, making them less sensitive to radiation. So although it is possible that cockroaches would take over the planet upon nuclear devastation, even these ancient insects are not entirely invincible. If an explosion were powerful enough, they wouldn't be able to continue on. Few places in the world elicit the mystery and wonder that Stonehenge does. For hundreds of years, archaeologists and historians have puzzled over the ancient ruins, trying to piece together the truth behind its origin. At last, though, modern science has caught up with the ancient mystery, and we finally have a pretty good idea as to who created this wonder of the ancient world. For anyone living under a very large rock for the last 500 years and doesn't know, Stonehenge is an ancient site in the UK made up of pillars of rock laid out in a circle. The remains showed that the entire site was once ringed with massive stone columns, which were themselves topped with slabs of stone that completely encircled the monument. Inside, scientists suspect that there was once a smaller circle of stones, of which only a few pillars remain, also topped by a massive stone slab. While the site is relatively simple in its construction and certainly pales in comparison with wonders such as the pyramids of Egypt, what is impressive is that Stonehenge is estimated to have been built over 5,000 years ago, when humans were thought to have been largely using nothing more than simple bone and antler tools. The Neolithic monument is also thought to have taken 1,500 years to complete, with construction being taken up by various groups of people who continually added to the original site. The first stage was a massive circular ditch and bank dug on the Salisbury Plain by Neolithic Britons using deer antlers for tools. They also included deep pits inside of that circular construction, now known as the Aubrey Holes after John Aubrey, the 17th century antiquarian who discovered them. It's believed that the holes once held up a ring of timber posts standing upright, creating a circle of timber within the larger circular ditch. This site remained standing until a few hundred years later when more builders arrived and decided to remodel. Rather than use the timbers for their construction, they hauled 80 bluestones, of which 43 remained standing, and laid them out in either a horseshoe or circular formation around the site. Lastly, during the third and final phase of construction, which took place around 2000 BC, sandstone slabs were arranged into a ring formation around the entire site, with some being assembled into the iconic three-piece structures called trilithons. A few trilithons remain standing inside the formation today, and it's these structures that have become a visual representation of Stonehenge for millions of people around the world today. Work would continue for the next 400 years, with the large stones being repositioned as new people modified the original site. What's particularly impressive about Stonehenge is that the majority of the construction took place well before the invention of the wheel. That means that the sandstone blocks weighing over 40 tons had to be transported from up to 25 miles away, while the smaller bluestones, which weighed up to 4 tons each, were originally sourced from over 200 miles away. How in the world did Neolithic builders get these giant stones into position without even the use of the wheel? The longest standing theory is that the stones were transported using sledges and rollers made out of fallen tree trunks, with each stone riding atop a bunch of greased logs, which would be moved in front of the stone as it traveled over and past a section of logs. This would have allowed the builders to simply push or drag the huge stones over long distances, though it would certainly have been incredibly labor-intensive. They then could have transferred the stones into huge rafts and floated them along the Welsh coast and up to the River Avon toward the construction site. More modern refinements to the theory history has builders using teams of oxen to drag the stones along grooved planks, or transporting them in giant wicker baskets or on all kinds of ball bearings. However, in the 1970s, geologists began to get in on the debate of how the mighty stones were transported. They suggested that it wasn't humans who lugged these stones dozens or hundreds of miles, but rather that it was ancient glaciers. Well known to uplift rocks and transport them hundreds of miles, these glacial erratics, as they're known, pop up all over the world and are remnants of the last ice age. They proposed that perhaps glaciers had deposited a large number of raw stones required to build Stonehenge, though the theory isn't particularly popular amongst mainstream geologists. Never mind how it was built though, who were the people that actually built Stonehenge? Back when mythology was considered history, it was believed that Stonehenge was the handiwork of King Arthur's friend and confidant, the wizard Merlin. Sometime in the mid-5th century, hundreds of British nobles were killed by Saxon barbarians and then buried on the Salisbury Plain, which was at the time made out of stakes. And in order to honor the fallen men, King Aureolus Ambrosius, the uncle of King Arthur, ordered that a memorial be built on the site to honor their deaths. The king thus sent an army to Ireland to fetch a stone circle known as the Giant's Ring, which ancient giants had built from magical African bluestones. The Irish, defending the ring, were defeated, but the men could not move the massive stones. Thus, Merlin used his magic to move the giant stones across the sea and onto the site they stand on today. According to the legend, King Ambrosius and King Arthur's father Uther remain buried there to this day. When people started believing in myths less and science more, the monument was attributed to the Saxons, the Danes, the Romans, the Greeks, and even the Egyptians. Eventually, in the 17th century, archaeologist John Aubrey claimed that the monument was the work of Celtic high priests known as Druids, and the theory largely stuck for hundreds of years. Even today, many individuals who identify as modern Druids gather at the site to hold rituals. Yet, sadly for them, modern science has at last determined that it was definitely not the Druids who built Stonehenge. Stonehenge, it turns out, has an origin as complicated as its construction, and after the careful observation of dating bones and tools and other artifacts discovered on the site, archaeologists now believe that there was actually no one people who are responsible for building Stonehenge, but that rather the monument was a community project of sorts, with various groups of people working on it at different times. First were Neolithic agrarian humans, likely the original inhabitants of the British Isles, though some genetic research hints that these original inhabitants were actually displaced by invaders from the mainland. Then the descendants of the original Britons likely added to the site, followed by immigrants from the European continent, with some hypothesized to have come from as far as modern-day Turkey. Stonehenge, it turns out, has no one source, but rather is a hodgepodge of different cultures who likely all appropriated it to suit their own needs. We might never know why it was originally built, but it's clear that as new groups of people came across the site, they were quick to modify or add to the construction in order to suit their own needs. The site is thought to have served purposes related to astronomy, calendar keeping, religious ceremonies, and even as a royal monument, with its function throughout the years as varied as its original builders. While today it serves as a tourist destination for people who come from all over the world to marvel at the ingenuity of our ancestors. This is, of course, the official story, and other sources claim that Stonehenge is, you guessed it, alien in origin. Some believe that Stonehenge is part of a global navigation network used by alien ships, with sites that include the pyramids and the Nazca Lines in South America. Apparently, ancient aliens needed visual signals by which to navigate the spacecraft that they traversed the galaxy with because they never quite developed GPS technology. A very curious technological misstep. Yet others believe that Stonehenge is the site of a major vortex which spews out some kind of energy from the Earth. These believers claim that ancient humans could identify and tap into these magical vortexes. Yet somehow, for some reason, despite being able to land spacecraft on Mars, modern humanity is apparently unable to discover the same magical vortices that primitive humans did. For our part, after careful examination by our team of leading researchers, archaeologists, and historians, we here at the Infographics Show have deduced that Stonehenge is an interdimensional aperture through which space aliens from the Zeta Reticuli Nebula will one day invade in order to feed on our delicious brains. And seriously, who are you going to listen to? Leading researchers and scientists or the internet? As humans, we have a long history of coming to terms with the concept of death. We do our best to cope with the loss of our loved ones, as well as with the anticipation of our own impending demise. Many of us turn to spiritual guidance to bring us comfort with stories relating to the idea of an afterlife. Death has mystified us through the ages and across many different cultures. This is probably why our video, What Happens When You Die, has been so immensely popular. It's only natural to wonder about what happens and whether some distant future will provide us with the technology to bring us back to life after we pass on. Recent research suggests that this may be sooner than we could have ever previously imagined. In April 2019, scientists wanted to test the extent that oxygen deprivation in the brain was irreparable. They wanted to find out if cells in a lifeless, intact brain could have some of their functions repaired. They probably didn't expect for their attempts to lead to any major breakthroughs. After all, how much can you really restore in a dead brain? But as it turned out, they were in for a huge surprise. An experiment was conducted on the brains of 32 pigs acquired by researchers at Yale University. The pigs were already dead when their brains were collected for experimentation, taken from a slaughterhouse that distributed their meat for consumption. The intact brains of the pigs had been without blood and stored in room temperature for 4 hours after death before the experiment began. A system known as BrainX was used to pump experimental solution into the brains, acting as an artificial blood circulation. The solution contained a chemical so that it would be more easily detectable when scientists later used an ultrasound to track the flow of it. After 6 hours of allowing the solution to transfuse through the pig's brains, researchers were stunned by what they found. It's like something out of a science fiction movie. The brains regained the ability to take in air and glucose, restoring oxygen to their tissues. There was also a shocking return of some synaptic activity between neurons as well as reduced cell deterioration. Clinically speaking, though, it couldn't be classified as a living brain. It was a cellularly active one. This floored the scientists who probably couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Researchers did not want to risk the brains regaining consciousness, so the solution that was used in transfusion contained chemicals intended to block nerve signals, just in case. Had any conscious activity been detected, the team planned on medicating the brains with anesthetic drugs and then freezing them immediately in order to shut down the process before it could go too far. Perhaps they were afraid of experiencing the horror of accidentally creating zombie pig brains. As interesting and creepy as it sounds to turn The Walking Dead or Frankenstein into potential foreseeable reality, the scientists more likely took this precaution due to the ethical concerns. After all, allowing consciousness in these brains, however unlikely that may be, would be undeniably cruel given their detachment from the bodies. Certainly, this would create quite a problem for the Board of Ethics. The pig brain study suggests that being alive or dead is not that simple, and that these two concepts are not as black and white as they may seem. There may not be a definitive line distinguishing the two, and there could be such a thing as being partly alive or partly dead. In essence, the study has opened the eyes to the possibility of a new way of being, and it's shown us that death can occur in stages, with some of our functions able to continue after other parts have long deteriorated. We tend to think that we're gone once we're declared clinically dead by a doctor. What is construed as clinically dead, however, does not hold consistent meaning and has undergone considerable changes throughout the years. Death used to be pronounced as certainty once the heart stopped beating. Later, the conceptualization of death turned to the brain, and we decided that official death could only be determined after this vital organ stopped functioning. But now, the findings from this research have given us a reason to challenge everything that we know, as the haunting evidence suggests that cellular activity can be restored in the brain after death. How can we now define true clinical death? With the advent of new knowledge comes more questions, and this is certainly true as it pertains to ethical considerations. As cited in Medical News Today, the study throws into question long-standing assumptions about what makes us alive. The newsletter also mentions that there may be limitations in future research regarding regulations for animals used in experiments. Determining that there may be some form of life after death creates confusion in what is considered harmful to creatures, and how dead an organism needs to be before it can be used for testing. To say this is a small advancement in medical knowledge is a colossal understatement. The technology used to spread the experimental solution into the intact brains of the pigs has paved the way for finding new treatment methods for people who suffer from strokes, brain injuries, and diseases like Alzheimer's. The New York Times explains that this study may lead the way to a future consisting of fewer brain-dead patients and less need for organ donors. This is because if doctors can use something like BrainX to work more extensively on resuscitating their patients, there may be less need to harvest organs. So now we turn to the big questions. Do the results from the pig study mean that we found a way to bring the dead back to life? Does this imply that zombies could be such a thing? Technically, but not entirely. There's no need to evacuate into your underground bunker just yet. Although scientists prepared to stop the brains if they did regain consciousness, there were no signs of budding intelligent activity during the study. Although active, the brains were not close to establishing awareness. Still, if even some cellular function can be brought back to life, this opens the avenue for other areas of research that could potentially lead to learning more about the mechanisms of the action that drive consciousness. Though this type of experiment has a long way to go before human trials can begin, we've already come a long way. Since the dawn of our existence, we've assumed that our bodies can only ever be in one of two different states. That is, either the state of being alive or the state of being dead. Once we're dead, that's it, lights out. There's no returning to life without a miracle or some form of divine intervention. This reality has long been presumed as an absolute truth, despite many of us wishing otherwise. But there are many supposed truths that have been debunked by science. Until the late 1990s, for instance, we thought that the expansion of the universe was slowing down. Since then, we've discovered the opposite, that the universe is expanding with increasing speed. We also used to think that humans as a species possessed more genes than simple organisms like amoebas. Thanks to the Human Genome Project in 2003, however, we've since learned that a tiny moss plant has more genes than us. Nothing is above inquisition. This includes the idea that we cannot be brought back to life once we're fully dead. It's probably not beyond the realm of possibility that we could eventually learn how to bring ourselves back to life, but we're just not quite there yet. Perhaps learning how to do this will bring us forward into a new step in our evolution. But the question is, would you actually want to be resurrected? Or would you rather just be left in peace? Though immortality sounds like it would be cool, being continuously resurrected every time you die and living forever while getting to see future advancements of mankind, it may not be all that great. You could get bored and fed up of your existence. Some elderly people report feeling ready to die because they've lived long enough. The longest living woman on record was Jeanne Clement, a French woman who lived a whopping 122 years and 164 days. Clement was born in 1875, just 10 years after the American Civil War ended. She was alive to witness the inventions of the light bulb, telephones, cars, televisions, and computers. She saw 3 American presidential assassinations, both world wars, as well as the emergence of the internet. Despite witnessing the progress of mankind, however, her longevity provided her with a lonely existence. Living so long was both a blessing and a curse, as she outlived her husband, her daughter, and even her grandson. With no remaining relatives, she made a deal with a lawyer that he could inherit her house after she died if he paid her 2,500 francs per month. She outlived him too. Seeing so many people and things come and go, she was ready when she finally passed in 1997. She once stated, "I wait for death and journalists," poking fun of the fame she earned for living so long. After enduring such a lengthy existence, we don't imagine she'd be very happy if some scientist suddenly came out of nowhere from the future and reanimated her consciousness. She might say something like, I thought I was done. Why do you have to bring me back?" Thus, we suggest you think carefully before deciding that you want to come back to life if it ever becomes a choice. So, just for fun, let's return to the question of the impending zombie apocalypse. Since the pig study only suggests the resurrection of some cellular function, even if there were zombies derived from this, they probably wouldn't be able to consciously think. At most, maybe they'd have restored their motor functions like Mike, the famous headless chicken. We imagine that any reanimated human corpses would just continually walk into a wall with no concept of direction. For this reason, an outbreak of zombies would probably be very easy to defeat while posing no real threat to human civilization. We do, however, have a certain type of zombie in existence now. There's something known as walking corpse syndrome or Cotard syndrome, a rare condition where people believe they're dead. Their delusion may cause them to think that they're missing body parts or have lost their soul. There was a case of a 53-year-old Filipino woman with Cotard syndrome who believed that she smelled like rotting fish. She requested to be brought to the morgue so that she could be amongst her own kind. She was given antipsychotics and antidepressants to treat her condition, which improved her symptoms. Cotard syndrome was first described in 1882 by Dr. Jules Cotard as being a condition with which patients find it difficult to deal with their external reality. Though this isn't quite as dramatic as the zombies who have an appetite for brains and television and movies, it's still creepy to wonder what life would be like if everyone suddenly came down with this condition, sluggishly meandering around city streets thinking that they're dead. Imagine to get your cheese fix, you had to meet a man down a dark alley. He turns up late as usual and you ask him, "What do you got?" He takes a cautious look around and responds, "What are you after? I got cheddar, camembert, some of that homegrown Monterey Jack, Gouda, feta, and if you got the dough, I can sort you some of that potent Serbian poulet." You tell him you're actually a bit broke, and so he opens up his jacket to reveal a packet of Kraft cheese slices. That stuff does nothing for you anymore, so you ask him if he's got any of that strong Mexican cotija he had last week. "Sorry dude," he says, "there was a big bust at the border, but I got some Nova Scotian Dragon's Breath Blue coming in if you can hang on for a few days." This might sound utterly ridiculous to you, but tell us how ridiculous it is after you watch this show. We don't need to tell you that people love cheese. It's pretty much a universally eaten thing, and where you find cows, buffalo, goats, or sheep, you'll usually find cheese. In fact, we've been eating this stuff since before recorded history, so we don't really know who came up with the concept of cheese. We also don't know who first started making it, but it's thought that once we had domesticated sheep some 8,000 years ago, we soon had cheese. It could have been a lucky accident because back in those days, milk and other liquids were transported in the leak-proof organs of animals. It's thought that the milk on the stomach lining, when warmed, would have curdled it. Voila! Accidental cheese. And that happy accident led to cheese eating in ancient Egypt, ancient China, ancient Rome, and other places. There's plenty of proof of cheese eating all around the world from ancient times. Roman texts show us that cheese making was seen as an art form, and those Romans were excellent at the art. Cheese making spread through Northern Europe, and then we saw different kinds of cheese, such as aged or blue cheeses. So, how much do we eat? Well, first of all, we eat more cheese from cow's milk than any other animal. Next is goat cheese, sheep cheese, and buffalo cheese. Cheese data tells us that in 2018, $32.1 billion worth of cheese was exported around the world. You can find reports stating that the cocaine market is much bigger than that. But according to the book Narconomics, the market value of cocaine is sometimes exaggerated because there's an astronomical difference between how much it costs to make and how much it's eventually sold for. 500 kilos in Peru taken by police is not worth the amount it's worth on the streets of the USA. It's also not as if cocaine traffickers and dealers are handing in monthly reports to the government. It's estimated that around 4% of the population have tried cocaine at least once in their lifetime, but estimates vary and it's really hard to get to the truth. What we can say is it's not as popular as cheese by any stretch of the imagination. Cheese consumption is also hard to pin down, with some sources saying that the Danish eat the most cheese per capita, and others say it's the Greeks. All sources tell us that the Europeans eat the most cheese, but the Americans are not too far behind in per capita terms. EU countries produce the most cheese altogether, with Germany out front and Italy behind, but the USA produces more cheese than any other nation. Reports state in 2018 the USA produced a whopping 5.88 million metric tons of cheese, and production has been steadily going up over the years. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the average American in 2017 ate 15 pounds of American cheese and 22 pounds of imported cheeses. That's quite a lot of cheese. That department also says the most eaten variety in the U.S. is mozzarella, followed by cheddar. Why are we giving you all these numbers? Well, just to show you that people in general consume vast amounts of cheese. You could ask a cheese fan why he or she consumes so much of this stuff, and no doubt they'll tell you the reason is because it's simply delicious. They like it. They like how it makes them feel, but they wouldn't tell you they were addicted to it. You might ask a regular cocaine consumer why they spend every evening hoovering up white lines from the coffee table, and they tell you that they like it. It makes them feel good. You would then assume that they are addicted. You might also wonder, though, if cheese could be addictive like cocaine. It might seem silly to even ask, but if you look at news reports from 2015, you'll find many media organizations citing a scientific report that claimed that people were hooked on cheese. That Parmesan dust was just as addictive as the fine white powder originating from a coca leaf. Researchers from the University of Michigan wrote that cheese is what you might call very Moorish. They used something called the Yale Food Addiction Scale to measure how people crave cheese, and they said people crave it like they might crave a drug. The reason for this, they said, is because, like other dairy products, it contains the chemical casein, and this can trigger the brain's opioid receptors and give a person a feeling of well-being. The cheese eater takes a bite and soon feels slightly euphoric. No doubt he'll go back for more at some point. People in the study were also asked to pick the foods they thought were the most addictive, and it turned out the food containing cheese was craved a lot. You might think, well, if it's down to the casein chemical, then why don't I crave milk? The researchers wrote that in cheese it's far more concentrated, so you get a much bigger hit. You get it in milk, but less so. One of the authors from that study wrote, "This is a first step toward identifying specific foods and properties of food which can trigger this addictive response." She also said by accepting some foods have addictive properties, we can better tackle obesity, and cheese in high doses packs a lot of calories. Okay, so does this mean after that report, we had CA groups, Cheeseaholics Anonymous? Hi, my name's Chris and I'm a cheese addict. This is my 7th day of sobriety. Well, it's nothing new that some things we consider innocuous or fairly innocuous provide us with a dopamine hit. That's just how our brain works. Its reward system gives us a feeling of pleasure for certain activities. We've all heard how Facebook can be addictive, or singing a religious hymn can make us feel great. Well, it's really about damage control. With Facebook, research has shown how people can't seem to get off the platform, and this has caused some amount of distress and depression for some hardcore users. Overconsumption of cheese might also help you pack on the pounds, but it's hardly comparable to the mess, pain, and problems a bad drug addiction will cause. Going out for a pizza should not be even remotely related to scoring a gram of China White and putting that stuff into your veins. Cheese addiction has been called scaremongering, and as we said, while it might give someone a light buzz because of something called the mesolimbic reward pathway, so do many things we do all day every day. We couldn't live without these rewards. We need dopamine, our artful pleasure chemical. Food stimuli is nowhere near as powerful as drug stimuli. Addictive drugs are craved for more by users than a cheese slice. We usually don't hold up a convenience store so we can get to that one final hit of French brie. We don't get restless legs and come out in sweats, throw up, and experience depression between 24 to 48 hours after our last plate of Swiss Emmental. Still, cheese seems to stimulate our dopamine receptors more than, say, a carrot or a stick of celery. Other nutrition scientists came out after the cheese is as addictive as cocaine media fest and said a cheese addiction seems impossible. Granted, they said, cheese does contain opiate-like substances, but that doesn't mean a person will get a full-blown addiction. Time magazine tackled the issue and concluded that no, cheese is not as addictive as cocaine. The writer said, indeed, when cheese is eaten, casein releases these substances called casomorphins. The researchers of the study said these have an effect on the brain like morphine, but this might not actually be true. It might not be the addictive element of cheese after all, and it might just be the fatty content of the stuff. They also point out that other very sweet and salty foods scored high on that craving scale, such as chocolate and chips. We should also say that the researchers themselves would later say that the media misstated them and oversimplified their work. They weren't really saying that cheese is as addictive as cocaine, but hey, a headline like that pulls in readers. We are in some ways addicted to food, otherwise we would die. We'd need some amount of stimulation from eating so we eat and stay alive. Just as a neuroscientist at the National Institute on Drug Abuse in Bethesda said, drugs exploit the reward systems we have. Drugs take over them, and as some of you will know, some people hooked on drugs sometimes forego regular eating or perhaps lovemaking and instead get their kicks from the substance. This isn't the same as liking cheese. Lots of things that give us pleasure are not bad for us, and cheese is hardly enemy number one. Another neuroscientist said this about the addictiveness of cheese compared to cocaine. Addictive drugs do things that food doesn't do to make them more addictive. To put these foods on par with something like cocaine is pretty inflammatory. So while you might have heard the term dairy crack or this is your brain on cheese, and even though you could have a very mild fondness for eating cheese, you really don't need to worry about eating cheese. If you're very overweight and think you eat a lot of it, well, maybe it's time to cut back a little. You won't have to attend Cheeseaholics Anonymous though, and at no point in the future will you have to buy your British Stilton on the dark web or from that guy that hangs around the corner of the block. Other researchers tell us that this fondness for cheese might just be linked to our fondness of drinking milk when we're babies, and the same goes for young animals. That mother's milk is our lifeline, and cheese is just a stronger version of that milk. The cheese business might think about us as addicts though. Listen to this. Forbes came out with an article in 2017, and it talked about a presentation once given by Dairy Management Inc. The discussion was how to get people eating more cheese. Forbes writes that the presenter said what we needed was people to be triggered into eating more cheese. He also said there were two kinds of cheese eaters, enhancers and cravers. The former are people who just sprinkle a bit of cheese here and there, and they weren't worth targeting. The latter were people that eat cheese in bulk. The need cheese every day people, not the weekend dabblers. They said the way to target the heavy hitters was to put cheese in all sorts of things, and that's why you see the word cheesy these days before a lot of foodstuffs. There's nothing too nefarious about this though, business merely exploits the things we crave. These people could hardly be labeled cheese pushers. They do need to get rid of more of it though, because not long ago, the US Department of Agriculture announced that, at least in the USA, there was a 1.4 billion pound cheese surplus. NPR wrote that there was enough stashed cheese in the US to wrap about the Capitol building. The reason given was people were drinking less milk, while more Americans were turning their backs on the processed varieties that have driven the US market in the past, and have turned toward the European varieties, the hard stuff and the soft stuff. More Americans apparently now are looking for a more exotic cheese hit. How do you want to go out of this world? Probably resting peacefully, slipping away in your sleep, completely unaware of it happening. That makes sense since most people are afraid of death, so what better way of crossing over to the other side than when you aren't aware? Us though, we'd prefer to go out in a giant explosion, perhaps battling terrorists or a giant gorilla at the top of the Empire State Building. Or maybe even giant gorilla terrorists. We just think it'd be kind of weird to be asleep one moment and the next thing be sitting in the afterlife. But if you die in an explosion, it's quick, painless, and you're fully aware of what just happened. And bonus points for going out killing a bunch of terrorists or rampaging giant gorillas. But what's science have to say about the absolute worst ways to die? Let's dig deep and answer yet another of life's most pressing questions. Eaten alive. Alright, we didn't exactly consult any scientists on this one. We just figured that dying while being eaten alive has to be one of the worst ways to go there is. And we're not talking about getting chomped on by an animal and then bleeding out and dying. We're talking about being alive for the entire or at least a large portion of the experience. And there's several ways this could happen to you, even in the safety of your big city. Most large predators will kill their prey with a single bite or blow to a vital area. Lions, cheetahs, and tigers all have an innate instinct to go for the jugular and suffocate a victim to death. Bears and mountain lions share this instinct as well, and it exists for the protection of the predator rather than some sense of mercy for the prey. Being a predator is all about taking risks, and every hunt involves the risk of injury, which can be fatal for a predator who needs to hunt daily to survive. That's why most predatory animals have evolved to find the most efficient way to kill, rather than wound prey and risk them fighting back. Some animals, though, show little regard for their own safety in bringing down and eating prey. Enter the hyena, one of the most savage predators in the world, and the last animal you'd want to be eaten by. Hyenas typically hunt in packs, but can often go on solo hunting expeditions. Unlike other pack animals, hyenas, though, don't suffocate their prey. Hyenas start eating their prey alive before it's dead. Prey will find themselves swarmed by hungry hyenas who bite and tear into their flesh, often consuming large quantities of it before the animal finally dies from massive blood loss. Typically, this means disemboweling the prey and going for the soft bits around the stomach area, while lesser-ranking members rip the legs from the body so as not to risk angering the senior hyenas who feast on the soft stomach bits. By the time any vital organs are finally consumed, the prey animal has been watching itself be eaten alive for a significant amount of time. Even worse though is when solo hyenas hunt. While a pack might tear apart prey in a minute or less, the solo hyena follows the same feeding strategy, but that can drag death out over many minutes. Even more terrifying is the fact that hyenas have attacked many campers out in the African bush, eating them alive within their tents. If you think you're safe in the city, think again. Just last year, a toddler was eaten alive by ants, and only saved from her fate after authorities investigated claims of abuse and neglect by neighbors. By the time the police arrived, the child was completely covered by ants, who had consumed parts of her body. In 2015, a former beauty queen was eaten alive in her nursing home after her body became infested by hundreds of thousands of mites. Staff not only neglected the woman, but were warned not to touch one of her hands for fear it would simply fall off. The coroner who performed her autopsy said it must have taken her months or years to die, and it must have been horribly painful. Slow deaths are probably the worst way to go, and our next worst way to die is all about going slow. Burning alive. Fire hurts. Trust us on this one, we've researched it. But the good thing about burning alive is that typically you either die from the extreme heat before your body is consumed by flames, like happened with many people burned at the stake, or you're consumed by fire so quickly that it sears off your nerve endings before you can register much of the pain. But what if the fire was slow to spread and not particularly large? In that case, the fire won't generate so much heat and smoke that it makes breathing difficult, leading to asphyxiation. Nor would it spread fast enough to consume large parts of your body and sear off the nerve endings. A slow-burning fire starting at the feet would move slowly enough that while any nerves in direct contact with flames would die, all the nerve endings remaining along the length of your body would very much be alive and transmitting pain signals to your brain. Some ancient societies used this particularly brutal method of execution regularly, letting victims be consumed by a controlled fire from the feet up. But today, if you're caught in a particularly nasty vehicle accident, you could suffer a similar fate. Imagine being trapped in a cage of broken metal, Good Samaritans unable to pull you out as your car slowly burns. The incredible heat would roast your body as flames slowly consume you. Our next method of death will have you begging for sweet release and was experienced by one man who was kept alive for 83 days against his will. Radiation. Death by radiation is a grim prospect and probably one of the most gruesome ways of passing away. When your body is blasted by radiation, the high-energy particles zipping through your body can destroy cells or damage your DNA, causing harmful mutations. We're not talking superpowers here unless your superpower is to get cancer. If exposed to a high enough radiation dose, your body's cells and even your DNA can be so badly affected that you simply start to break down physically. Typically, a person starts exhibiting radiation sickness after an exposure of about 200 rem. For comparison, a chest X-ray is equivalent to about 0.02 rem. At 200 or higher rem, the risk of cancer is drastically increased, and odds of survival begin to plummet. You could look forward to a slow, lingering death in a hospital bed that can take weeks or months. And unlike regular cancer, which has a chance of being treated, the damage caused by radiation is so severe that the resulting cancers are simply unstoppable. The only way to save you would be to repair your DNA, something we're currently unable to do. What if you had no DNA left in your body though, like a Japanese man in 1999 who became the only human in history to have no DNA? Hisashi Auchi was a technician at a nuclear power facility who suffered the greatest direct radiation exposure of any person to date. The accident occurred when too much uranyl nitrate solution was dumped into a precipitation tank, pushing the uranium content to a level that caused the fuel tank to go supercritical and temporarily become a makeshift nuclear reactor. This resulted in Auchi, who is the one pouring the liquid, to be blasted with an incredible 17 sieverts of radiation. That's the equivalent to being blasted with 85,000 chest X-rays all at once. Typically, 8 sieverts are considered fatal, and Auchi had received twice that dose. So needless to say, his outlook seemed grim. Doctors were shocked to discover that the damage to his body was so extensive that they discovered no DNA left in his blood, and soon after the accident, his body began to decompose from the inside out. Incredibly, Auchi would survive for 83 gruesome days. As his body broke down, doctors found it increasingly difficult to draw blood, which was itself becoming thick, brackish, and brown. Auchi's flesh began to fall off his body, and nurses were forced to wrap him in bandages just to keep him from bleeding through his own flesh and dying to blood loss. Doctors desperately tried to keep Auchi alive by pumping him with multiple blood transfusions a day, but after just a week, Auchi begged that he be allowed to die. His doctors, however, knew this was a once-in-a-lifetime chance to study the effects of radiation on the body and refused his request. The blood transfusions continued and were the only things keeping Auchi alive as his own body became unable to produce new blood cells. The bandages his body was wrapped in were keeping his flesh from falling off the bone, and in a small act of mercy, Auchi was placed in a medical coma. Auchi's right leg eventually simply fell off at the knee, and within a few weeks he resembled a living skeleton. Finally, Auchi passed away from a heart attack on day 83, weighing less than a quarter of his original weight, and mostly just a skeleton wrapped in a thin layer of flesh. Our next way to die is not just very possible in our modern world, but incredibly painful: dehydration. Compared to slowly falling apart due to radiation, dehydration seems like a rather easy way to die. That's only because you don't know the science of one of the worst ways to die. Whether you're lost in a desert or simply trapped in an elevator for several days, you have about 3 days before dehydration will kill you. Dehydration starts at losing 2% of your body's weight worth of water, which you can do by nothing more than rigorous exercise for an hour or a long walk on a very hot day. This effectively makes you thirsty, and as your body begins to panic about water loss, it shuts down any ways of losing water that aren't completely vital to your survival. You'll begin to sweat far less, which is bad news because sweating is one way we keep from overheating. Your urine will also become very dark as your body sends less water to the bladder, and the smell will be much more pungent. After 2 days of no water, your blood thickens in your veins, leading to greatly decreased blood flow. This in turn causes your skin to shrivel up on your body, and with a loss of blood pressure, you become prone to fainting. Your body will no longer waste water on sweating, which puts you at a great risk of overheating. Shortly after, your body kills the flow of blood to non-vital organs in an attempt to keep you alive. This means that organs within your body begin to wither and die, and toxic waste begins to build up inside you. At this point, your insides slowly start to become a toxic dump. Your muscles also begin to cramp from a lack of water and salt, leading to incredible pain. Imagine the worst Charlie horse you've ever experienced, but all over your body instead of just one of your legs. Then imagine it lasting for a day or more. Eventually, your body simply can't continue functioning without water, and the buildup of toxic wastes in your body will become fatal. Unable to expel waste, your breaking down organs poison you from the inside out, and your blood thickens even further, becoming more a sludge-like paste than a free-flowing red groovy you're familiar with. At this point, if you don't start drinking water immediately, you'll be dead within the day. Turns out there's a lot of incredibly painful and horrifying ways to die, though for us, being eaten alive by wild hyenas or even ants in your own home is probably the most terrifying. If this video has scared you, just remember, death is inevitable and it comes for all of us. But some of us will experience more horrifying deaths than others. In his world-famous book Beyond Good and Evil, philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche warned, "And if thou gaze long into an abyss, the abyss will also gaze into thee." Since Nietzsche was not fond of explaining his own aphorisms, many have debated exactly what he meant by this statement, with most taking it to mean that the longer you spend studying an unsettling or evil thing, the more time that thing has to work on you and your perception of the world. This might help explain the PTSD-like symptoms of crime scene investigators hardened against humanity after years of inspecting grisly crime scenes. Whatever Nietzsche meant in his book, just this year, astronomers found that as they themselves stared into the abyss of the cosmos, the abyss began to stare back in a very terrifying way. One night this past October, European astronomers looking through new photos from the Hubble Space Telescope were shocked by the discovery of what's perhaps the most unsettling galaxy yet discovered. The galaxy has been named Arp-Mador 2026-424 and has an uncanny resemblance to a human skull. The most prominent and terrifying feature is the two huge eyes, which seem to be staring directly at Earth from millions of light years away. AM 2026-424, or the Skull Galaxy, is actually two separate galaxies captured by Hubble in the midst of a deadly head-on collision. Galaxies collide all the time, but for two galaxies to run into each other almost perfectly head-on is very rare indeed. In this case, the galactic cores haven't yet smashed into each other, and it makes it look as if the entire formation has two eerie glowing eyes. Below the eye clumps of stars form what looks like a skeletal nose and mouth, and above the eyes, the stars thrown into a wild elliptical orbit around the new galactic core make the entire formation look like a giant skull. What's even stranger about the Skull Galaxy is the fact that it seems as if two galaxies involved in this deadly head-on collision were about the same size when they ran into each other. That's a very rare event, as typically larger galaxies swallow up smaller galaxies, and equally sized galaxies rarely ever get a chance to collide. The two galaxies that make up this new single galaxy haven't yet finished their merging process though, and luckily for humanity, it'll probably take another 1 to 2 billion years for the formation to settle into a traditional flattened disk shape. Unluckily for any alien life in those galaxies, things could get very weird over the next 2 billion years. And that's because even though the likelihood of actual physical collisions between planets and stars in the two galaxies are extremely unlikely, the effect of gravity could very well become extremely unpredictable. With such a dramatic shift in the galaxy's center of gravity, stars and their accompanying systems could be flung into wild new orbits. Add in the effect of gravity from new stars that make up the other galaxy, and traditional orbits could be thrown into potentially deadly loops. You don't, after all, have to have a head-on collision between star systems to spell doom for life on a planet. The influence of gravity from other stars around yours could be enough to nudge comets and asteroids into new orbits, and they themselves could now be put into an intersecting orbit with your home planet. That's bad news for anyone who doesn't like extinction-level impact events, which is pretty much most life, except crocodiles and sharks, which can apparently survive literally anything except mankind. Star systems could also find themselves completely orphaned from their home galaxy or the newly formed one. That's right, gravitational perturbations of orbits could be so great that a star could very well be flung completely free of the galaxy, doomed to wander the black void between galaxies forever, or at least until it dies. For life on that star system, it might sound like great news. After all, that life would now be basically protected forever from the effect that any neighboring stars could have on them. No more random supernovas to obliterate your planet, or deadly deadly gamma ray bursts that sanitize the surface of your world of all life. No more orbital disturbances from nearby stars that fling asteroids and comets into new deadly orbits. For intelligent life, though, it might be a very depressing turn of events, because being orphaned from your galaxy also means that you'll never get a chance to explore another star system. No chance of ever discovering alien life that doesn't exist within the realm of your parent star. One day, your species will be guaranteed to die because you'll be unable to avoid the extinction brought about by the death of your star by simply moving to another star system. Truly a depressing turn of events, yet scientists believe that there's very many of these orphaned star systems, and even within our own galaxy, many orphaned planets as well. Imagine that the Earth got slingshotted straight out of the solar system and forced to wander space between stars with no sun of its own. That's the fate of many so-called rogue planets, or as some call them, dark planets, as they have no light from a sun to shine on them. Skull Galaxy is a terrifying sight to behold, and we can thank our lucky stars, perhaps literally, that our own galaxy is safe from such chaos. Though our home, the Milky Way, is itself on a deadly collision course with our nearest galactic neighbor, the Andromeda Galaxy, located 2.5 million light-years away. Andromeda is steadily speeding toward us at a rate of about 68.3 miles per second. We aren't quite on a head-on collision course with Andromeda, though that will matter very little in our ultimate fate. The two galaxies are going to fly by each other so close that in relative terms, one could reach out and touch the other. The massive gravity of the two galactic cores will then yank each galaxy back toward the other after initially speeding by, and the two galaxies will begin orbiting around a common center of gravity, gradually but inexorably falling into each other. During the first flyby, entire chunks of galaxy will be ripped out of each participant, with stars flung every which way. The traditional spiral arms of the Milky Way will be bent and deformed, and the extremities will likely be completely amputated. Some of the stars will fall into new orbits within the Milky Way Andromeda system, while others will be flung out into deepest space to die a cold, lonely death in the darkest depths of space. As the galaxies spin nearer and nearer to each other, they'll accelerate, and gravitational perturbations will become even more pronounced. Gas and dust clouds will be sent hurtling into each other, spawning a new age of star formation and creating titanic stellar nurseries. Other stars might be sent directly into each other, obliterating any life in their systems. Yet other stars will suffer as terrifying a death as those orphaned into intergalactic exile. They'll be flung into the newly merged supermassive black hole at the heart of a brand new galaxy. Luckily, all of this is pretty far away though, and given mankind's treatment of its own planets, we're sure to be long extinct before any of this comes to pass. Still, while today we look out into the night sky and are shocked by the skull-like grimace of two galaxies merging into one, perhaps one day, aliens far away will look at our galaxy merging with Andromeda and shudder in fear at the terrifying image such an incredible cosmic event might create. To anyone looking at you, you're just a person sleeping normally, although it seems your eyes are moving rapidly under their shutters and your body is jerking around a bit. What's actually going on in your head is a different matter altogether. You've just fought off your own family after returning home and finding your nearest and dearest have all become the living dead. If that isn't bad enough, during the bloody melee, the neighbors, zombies themselves, turn up at the back door. You manage to sneak out the front door and get in the car. Blasting down the highway, you take a corner just a little bit too fast. The car spins out of control and you're flung out the window. As you lie in the street, bones broken, a truck is coming right at you. You're done. The question is, can dying in a dream mean you die in real life? Could dreaming kill you? It's a bit of a complicated question since dreaming presents some dangers, but they're not all alike. Let's take, for instance, the scary dream we just talked about. Could the shock of lying in the street and seeing a huge truck drive right into your body finish you off in real life? If you've seen our show about literally being scared to death, then you would think the answer would be yes. If you didn't see that show, it was mainly about people experiencing so much fear that their body produced too much adrenaline and that led to heart failure. This has happened to quite a lot of people, but that was when they were not sleeping. We found some sources that told us that heart function might be stressed during sleep, and especially during the stage called REM, or rapid eye movement, and this is when we dream. Well, REM sleep does make us breathe faster, our heart rate increases, and so does our blood pressure. So if you already have heart problems, then it would make sense that a dream could send a person over the edge. One doctor said this: REM sleep is a stressor because it's stimulating your amygdala, the part of your brain responsible for emotions. Combine this overactive amygdala with poor cardiac health, and you're much more vulnerable to having a heart attack. The National Institutes of Health looked into this matter and actually found 4 cases of people who had no history of heart problems who suffered what NIH called deadly dreams. It wrote that in those cases, intense nightmares caused life-threatening cardiac events, although the people didn't die. It's hard to find out just how many deadly heart attacks have been brought on by nightmares because there doesn't seem to be many studies about this. One doctor at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York said it would be a rare thing for someone to have a heart attack brought on by a nightmare, but there is indeed a potential for them being life-threatening given what happens to our bodies when we're dreaming. If the last thing on a person's mind before they died was being chased by zombies though, we just wouldn't know about it. Then there's something called REM behavior disorder, which when we dream during that stage called REM, we're usually in a state of paralysis. That's good because you wouldn't want to be acting out while you're dreaming. The problem for some people though is that for them, the paralysis can be incomplete or not there at all. We looked at some cases described by Psychology Today detailing what happened to people who often experienced REM behavior disorder. The article explained that when it happened to these people, the part of the brain that controls muscles woke up, but the dreamer remained asleep. The results were sometimes frightening. One man said his wife had a recurring dream about being attacked. She would get up in bed, still asleep, and start throwing punches. She even occasionally hit him during these episodes. She also moved her head from side to side as if she was being hit herself. This had been going on for 28 years. The couple were afraid to travel or stay at friends' houses because the woman might experience this kind of sleep aggression. In another case, a former military man would just get up and start lashing out as if he were in a fight. He would sometimes hit things in the room, and this would on occasion lead to an injury. When he woke up, he would say that he'd been dreaming about combat. In yet another case, a man, a physician of all things, would sometimes just start hitting his sleeping wife in the face in the morning. Once he had awoken, he would say he had absolutely no recollection about what had taken place. No doubt he felt terrible, but he had no idea why he had done it and didn't mention anything he had dreamed that might have been the cause. And no, it wasn't because the two had marital problems. This was a healthy, loving relationship. Why he did it was a mystery, but with medication it thankfully stopped. In these cases, no one was killed, but medical sources say the problem with these dreams is the possibility of injury. A person might just fall out of bed, hit their head, and die. It's very rare, but every year people do die from falling out of bed. So with that in mind, a bad dream mixed up with some REM behavior disorder could result in death. We must now talk about something called parasomnias. The meaning of this is basically unusual things happening to someone when they're sleeping. Sleep paralysis is one. So is the aforementioned REM sleep behavior disorder, and so is sleepwalking. Some sources say about 10% of Americans occasionally have some kind of parasomnia, and we guess quite a few of you have witnessed someone doing something weird while they're sleeping. It's usually not something to worry about, but there are extreme cases. We already know some people might exhibit what's called sleep aggression, which can come as a bit of a shock for the person on the other side of the violence. In the extreme, people have actually done very, very bad things while asleep. There was something in the law world known as the sleepwalking defense. We found a bunch of cases when this was used. The cases involved people who had killed people in their sleep. Just listen to the description of this case. On the night of the death, he arose from bed, drove 14 miles to the house of his in-laws, with whom he was said to be close, and strangled his father-in-law until the man passed out. He bludgeoned his mother-in-law with a tire iron and stabbed them both with a kitchen knife. This man, in the case known as Regina versus Parks, almost died himself in the attacks since he had managed to sever tendons in his hand. He woke up after doing what he had done, drove straight to a police station and said, "I think I've just killed 2 people." He was found not guilty in the end after experts said the man had committed the act of violence while he was sleepwalking. If someone can do this while sleepwalking, surely they can do a lot more damage to themselves. Sleepwalking doesn't happen during REM, but what happens to them during the episode might feel like a dream once they've fully awoken. You might describe it as dreaming and being awake at the same time. For instance, we found one case of a young man sleepwalking and he got up and saw his pet dog. The dog was asleep and fine, although the man was in dream mode and thought the dog was on fire. He picked up the animal and took it to the bathroom, whereby he proceeded to hold it under cold water. We know this could be dangerous to other people, and we now know it might disrupt the relationship you have with your beloved pooch. But could it be bad news for you? Well, if you've heard the story about the British 15-year-old girl who woke up at the top of a crane after climbing 130 feet, you'll know the answer is yes. In one article published in the Journal of Forensic Science written by Mark Malwald, the director of the Minnesota Regional Sleep Disorder Center, he listed a bunch of cases of people dying while sleepwalking. An example included a guy running out into the street only to meet a truck. Other cases he wrote about involved people with a history of sleepwalking falling from windows and balconies in the night. In such cases, people might not have a history of depression, but do have a history of somnambulism, another word for sleepwalking. There are quite a few other cases when people were stopped by the police after driving erratically, and the cops would later report the people seemed to be sleepwalking and not fully conscious. This can be called a kind of dreaming because people who have awoken from sleepwalking have reported having visions while in their somnambulistic state. While they wake up and realize these visions make no sense at all, but when they were sleepwalking, they have no control over themselves. Lastly, we must talk about something called parasomnia pseudo-suicide, which the National Institutes of Health says is when a person seems to have killed themselves consciously, but the act actually happened while the person was asleep. One of the more well-known cases of this involved a successful designer named Tobias Wong. His death was ruled a suicide, but his family and friends didn't think that was the case. In 2010, the New York Times wrote about this man, saying for years he had suffered from a variety of sleep disorders known as parasomnias. In layman's terms, he was a serious chronic sleepwalker. He would also often have sleep terrors, a kind of nightmare a person is having but can't quite wake up from. These are not quite normal nightmares because they happen during non-rapid eye movement sleep. They've been called a kind of panic attack while in a state of half-deep sleep. Sufferers might get up and scream, punch thin air, or worse. They might seem awake, but they're actually sleepwalking. While people can generally wake up from a nightmare, people might feel stuck in a night terror. Tobias Wong had no history of mental illness according to the Times, but he had those episodes of night terrors and sleepwalking. He had them often too, and had tried all sorts of things to make them stop. At times, he had done things he wasn't proud of during these episodes, such as pulling a work of art from his house's walls and throwing it across the room. Then one night he went to sleep and his partner found him hanged the next morning. The people close to him believed this happened during one of those episodes of sleepwalking. It was a pleasant morning in California in 2018. A 68-year-old woman had escaped the harsh winter of Nebraska and had taken a yearly trip to a place called Carmel Valley. She was doing what she liked most, and that was trail running. Only this day, she rounded a corner and ran right into a swarm of flies. This was by no means out of the ordinary, but she later told doctors that this swarm was particularly annoying. The flies got in her mouth and eyes, she said, as she frantically tried to brush them away. A month later, and that woman complained that something was itching in her eyes. To her horror, she then discovered the source of the irritation was a squiggling worm, something which would later baffle doctors. What she had was called a zoonotic disease. That's when a bacteria, virus, or parasite from one animal is passed on to humans. Her particular disease was called Thalasia gulosa, and while it's actually quite common in the USA and Canada, it usually only affects cows. Doctors say now something weird is happening. That's the fact that these parasites are now getting into humans. We found another case, and this time the person was a 26-year-old woman, also from the USA. She said her eyes started itching, and so she investigated while she was working on a salmon fishing boat. She was horrified when she managed to pull out a worm that was about half an inch long. A spokesperson for the CCD's Division of Parasitic Diseases and Malaria had this to say about these strange cases. Cases of eyeworm parasitic infections are rare in the USA, and this case turned out to be a species of Thalasia that had never been reported in humans. This woman actually managed to remove 8 of the worms herself, which you can imagine wasn't the best job in the world. Doctors removed another 6 of the things, and in no time she was fine. The problem though is that if the worms are not removed, if that happens, there's a chance they might wriggle around so much that they cause damage in there, which could lead to blindness. If that doesn't make you feel lightheaded, the doctors in this case removed some worms that contained unhatched eggs in the larvae. And so what that means is these things can replicate in a person's eye. Leave those itches long enough and a person might find that they're home to a family of worms. A colony, if you'd like. This is what the CDC had to say about that. There were adult male and female worms in this woman's eye, and they'd obviously been able to mate. It's quite romantic in a way, isn't it? Anyway, they were having sex in her eye, and one of them is pregnant and has babies. It's said that the particular phasefly that causes all the problems was first seen in the USA sometime after World War II. But while cattle or cats or dogs are usually the victim, it seems humans are now fair game. The word on the street is that because there's so much more cattle now, there are many more face flies of this sort. One of the women who had eye worms told CNN that when she first removed one of them, it was wriggling, but it died soon after. She also said this: "My left eye just got really irritated and red, and my eyelid was droopy. I was getting migraines too, and I was like, what's going on? I pulled down the bottom of my eye and noticed that my skin looked weird there. So I put my fingers in with this sort of plucking motion, and a worm came out." She said the first thing she did was run to her work colleague and scream to her that she just pulled a worm out of her eye. Then she went to see a doctor and an ophthalmologist, but they were stumped as to what was up because they'd never seen anything like it. After that, she got on a plane and went to visit other experts. But she said they were even skeptical about what she claimed. Worms don't live in human eyes, they first said, but they were wrong. She said she got lucky, though, because as she was talking to this doctor, she felt one of them wiggle. She said, "Okay, look right now, it's on the move." She was right, and the doctor saw the thing. "I'll never forget the expression on their faces as they saw it move across my eye," the woman said. Okay, so they found the worm, but it turned out that the rest of them were not so easy at all to remove. And at first, the flushes didn't work. It didn't help matters that there was really not protocol for this, said the woman. This was new ground they were covering. She said it was not a pleasant feeling to know your eyes are host to worms, but the medical staff assured her that it was unlikely they'd burrow further in and would stay on the surface of the eyes. The woman later said, "I tried not to go to the darkest place. Like, are these worms going to paralyze my face or infect my brain or impact my vision?" You might be wondering why the flies are interested in human eyes in the first place. A doctor explained that flies really like tears because those tears are full of nourishment for them. The USA isn't alone. In Europe and Asia, there have been 163 cases of people being infected by eye worms, but the eye worm is not the same as the one found in the US. Their eye worm is known as Calopata. In Europe and Asia, the worms tend to pick on the young and the elderly simply because those people are not as good at swatting the flies away. If you don't want eye worms, then we suggest you don't let flies anywhere near your face and get good at wafting them away. In the case of the runner we talked about at the start of the show, she was just unfortunate to run into a bunch of flies. It's actually a good thing that these people have talked to the media, because one of the women said at first she thought she was going mad. She searched on the internet for eye worms and no one had talked about it. So now you know, if you start feeling something wriggling in your eye, you probably are not crazy. The good news, according to the CDC, is that it's super rare in humans. You have way more chance of being struck by lightning or winning the lottery than having a bunch of worms crawl around in your eye. Now go check out diseases that will kill you the quickest. Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.